Reporting system, and I have the honor of opening it up this morning. We're so glad to have all of you. We do have a sold-out event here, so there'll be people kind of trickling in. So if you have a chair next to you that's not taken, you can just kind of make it open so people know. And I know there's room at the front. There always is, right? So I'm just going to get it started here. I'm going to introduce Marie Dotseth. Marie Dotseth is our Assistant Commissioner at the Health Department for the Health Systems Bureau, and she's going to get our day kicked off. So Marie. Right, well, I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all here today. This is going to be a fantastic day. You know that you're here doing something really important, and so I am welcoming you. I get to thank you for the work that you have already done, the work that went into this day of learning, and for the work that you're going to do. I know that we all know this is very important. I'm going to be very brief and just provide you a couple of slides of context here. We know that we're not doing this work in isolation. There are a lot of societal issues that go along with what's going on here. You all probably are familiar with there was a legislative package passed this last session, and that we find ourselves as a society dealing with increasing deaths from overdoses. Increasing, it changes year to year. Now we have fentanyl becoming our most prevalent problem. Last year there were 422 people in Minnesota that died from opioid deaths, or died from opioid overdoses. And there were almost 7 times more heroin deaths last year than 6 years ago. So this is a problem in society. The legislative package that was passed last year that is being implemented right now as we speak includes a registration fee for manufacturers that's going to raise about $21 million, and that money is going to be used for grants, and you can see there, to fund prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery strategies, and to help counties, and to create some culturally appropriate treatment for Native American communities. So the work that you're doing fits right into a bigger movement, and it's an important piece of the picture. We know that from work that we've been doing in our substantiated nursing home maltreatment cases, you can see down there at the bottom, drug diversion has really been jumping in terms of what we are finding. And we know there's many, many reasons for this. We're focusing in on nursing homes here today because this was a CMP project, and so we think that this is important, but we also know we have something similar going on in assisted living from what we're seeing at the health department. So we're very excited. We have long talked about the need to prevent these kinds of problems in the first place, and we know that a key to that is leadership awareness. So the fact that we're even talking about this is a huge first step, but even more importantly is to give us something to do about it, to create a set of policies and tools that help you to prevent this from happening in the first place. And as the state's public health agency, that's our primary objective. So I just want to say thank you again, encourage you to learn and ask questions, help us figure out ways to use this tool and to improve it moving forward. And with that, I am actually going to turn it over to the experts who can tell you more. So enjoy your day.
Good morning. I can't see all of you all the way to the back. Can you all hear? Okay, that's a good thing. My name is Andrea Fraser. I am a nurse and I work for a company called Aviary. And the only reason why you will need to know that is because we are sending you to our website for tools for the end of the day, but we'll make sure that that's up here a little bit later. This is my colleague, Mike Selvage. Both of us are nurses with a background in leadership and a background in long-term care, all the way up to acute care. We worked a lot of different places in our careers. But we own a consulting company, and we have worked with a group of stakeholders across Minnesota since last fall, working on this pathway. And this has included everyone from pharmacists to nursing leadership to nursing home leadership to people in the State Department of Health, to really look at what do we know about this problem, what are we seeing about this problem, and then where do we even start to take steps to deal with drug diversion in the workplace. Both Mike and I have seen this firsthand with nurses who are addicted, who we are leading. And we know that it's a tremendous challenge. And we also know that it is a tremendous responsibility on our parts to protect our residents as they're in our home from people with addiction problems. And so it really is, as we look at our context of how do we do this in a way that makes sense, how do I take something that seems so overwhelming and break it down into steps that I can take 3 or 4 of them this year and implement them in my nursing home and really make a difference for my residents. And so we're hoping to do that with you today. We're going to spend some time looking at the long-term care diversion landscape. We did this in 2 ways, and we're going to talk to you about both of these. But when we started this project, we looked at every single investigation that the Minnesota Department of Health has done over the last 4 years, I believe?
2013.
Since 2013, so the last 6 years. We looked at every single investigation and we coded them for trends to try to figure out what we can learn. And at the same time, we did a comprehensive literature search to say, what do we know from the literature? And so we're going to spend the next 45 minutes. I am long-winded, but I am not that long. We will spend the next 45 minutes walking through what we learned in those. And so Mike and I are going back and forth, and I hope that it's not too distracting from the back and forth, but Mike did the investigation, or did the review of the investigations, and I did the literature search. And so it will help us to go back and forth a little bit and talk through what we learned and what we know, and then the next steps throughout the day as we look at what we're doing. We're going to look at this pathway that we've devised and then talk about next steps for you all, what you can do in your homes when you go back tomorrow in the midst of all of the other things that you're doing. How do we take this and make it manageable? And in a way that makes sense for your specific context. So do you want to talk about what you did?
So here is the data, the number of diversion cases that have happened across the state of Minnesota starting back in 2013. This data is going to differ just a bit from what was presented in our opening because we removed cases that weren't pertinent to this conversation. So you can have diversion in multiple ways, and diversion in the state definition can have some variances there. So this was pertinent to our project. And so you can see that the trend across time from 2013. And what we did to identify for this project, here are the F tags that we used in the distribution of the F tags. And I won't read them to you, but through the process, we removed duplicates, we screened for pertinence like we talked about, and we identified for our sample 47 diversion cases in Minnesota that were pertinent. This created 2,500 data sets, and as we go through this data set, first of all, if you had an incident in your home, everything's de-identified, no need to worry. AP in the state nomenclature up here is the perpetrator, and that's the person that has took the drugs yes. Here's our distribution, and this is our first slide, so I'm going to explain the slides here. We had 20 cases in not-for-profit, and as reference, we did this bar all the way across is a statewide distribution, so you can see how our distribution was relative. So in the sample we had 60 for-profit, but that was disproportionate relative to the state distribution of for-profit ownership structure. We had facility location. We had 18 in the urban and 25 cases in the rural, which was a disproportionate sample. We had, you can see our bed distribution. What you can see here is it's happening everywhere. It's an issue everywhere. And then you think, you have these stigmas that we build in our minds of, is this issue with quality? This was actually disproportionately found in five-star homes. And the question is it because our quality systems caught it? Or is this a bigger issue in five-star homes? It just challenges the way we look at this data.
So as we looked at the literature search, we started in and looked for drug diversion, for long-term care, for nursing homes, healthcare, nursing, physicians, providers, pharmacists, and we did every iteration of all of that to start looking. I did narrow this down to English-only articles because my Spanish isn't that good. And then we looked since 2014. We wanted to see in the last 5 years what we know. And we also looked in all healthcare settings. Our hospital systems are maybe a bit ahead from a technology perspective in what they're able to find. And so many of them have started creating pathways, and we look to say, what can we learn from them? But also knowing that long-term care is tremendously different from hospitals. We can't take a hospital pathway and apply it to long-term care. It just doesn't work. What we do know is that we're at the intersection of two huge health crises. The first is that 7 million people used prescription-based psychotherapeutic drugs non-medically in the last month in the United States. So we have a tremendous addiction problem of people using things in ways that they're not intended to be used. And at the same time, we have an absolute, the literature says that pain is under-recognized and under-treated in the long-term care setting. I was doing some reviews of dementia in this last week, and I learned that people with dementia receive about 1/4 of the pain medication for procedures as people who do not have dementia. And so we know that in the midst of this, we have some issues in making sure that our residents have their pain controlled well. And we also have some issues in the fact that we have an awful lot of narcotic out in our homes. We have an awful lot of controlled substance out in our homes. Then we ask the question, how often are drugs diverted? And the answer is we don't know. The literature says we don't know. And much of that is because it's clandestine. People don't say, I'm diverting over here. And if they did, it would be significantly more helpful. But what they found is that the addiction statistics are similar to that of the population. So lifetime addiction statistics for nurses are 10 to 15% of nurses will face addiction at some point in their lifetime. For physicians, it's about 8 to 12%. And what the ANA says and estimates right now is across nursing in all of its forms, they estimate that 6 to 8% of our nurses are practicing volunteer, which is horrifying to me, quite frankly. When I think about, I may have 10 nurses in my home, which means that about 10% of them, one of those nurses of my 10 probably is practicing volunteer at least some of the time. Often in long-term care, it's not a priority as I haven't identified any incidents in my home, so it can't be happening in my home. And so I have a lot of other things that I need to be focusing on. I have my CASPER metrics, I have other things, and I have my actual residents who have needs, and human need is infinite. And so I have a certain number of residents in my home, all of them have infinite need that day. And so how do we balance that with this problem that could be maybe happening in my home? But what the literature says in article after article after article is if we look for diversion, we will find it. And so if I am intentionally digging, trying to look for patterns, intentionally digging, trying to figure out what's going on in my home, there's a good likelihood that I will find something.
So back to our data set. And so we are going back in looking at all the homes, these 47 cases, and we looked at what time, let's start looking at the descriptions of these events. Are there trends in Minnesota that we need to be dealing with? And across the way, days of the week, there was multiples and unknown, clearly lead. If you look at the data, apparently you're safer on Thursday and Wednesday, but otherwise, is that an issue of we have greater leadership there, we have our teams there, we weren't able to identify why. Shifts, unknown, night shift, day shift, evening shift. We make up beliefs related to this, and the night shift has historically had the stigma with it, and it didn't play out in our data set. You'll see multiple unknowns here, and I'm going to take a pause and talk about, this is related to the quality of the data that was received from those reports, and so it's an opportunity that we are taking to improve the data collection methods going forward, so we have less of the unknown category. The length of time, this is fascinating, multiple months and years. These can go on for a long time. Obviously, there's single occurrences where the system's caught it quickly, but there's also a predominance of long periods of time. The length of time, again, we highlighted that. The role, the RN, LPN, MedTech, leadership, and unknown. Gender, again, unknown, female, and it matches our distribution of our staff. Number of victims, 2 to 5, 10 plus, 5, 10. It's interesting that demographics here.
With this in mind, what we also need to keep in mind is that the vast majority of people would never abuse or divert drugs. And so I think as we talk today, we're going to talk about all of these things that have happened and might happen, and we're about to tell you some pretty harrowing stories. And so from a perspective, from putting on our perspectives, we want to keep in mind that the vast majority of our people are not doing this or even thinking about doing this. When we started separating this out, we looked at our demographic data, but then we also looked at what type of buckets or categories, in this case we chose buckets, can we use to sort of lump these together. And where we landed is we're going to talk about security of medications, and that includes tampering and theft. What happens while the medications are locked up in our homes? Administration and documentation. What happens when someone is preparing medications, and how do they divert this in that process? Resident and medication transitions. So when we have a resident who is moving from one place to another place, or from the hospital to the nursing home, or to a different unit or neighborhood within my facility, what does that look like? And then around destruction and waste. And these categories are important because this foreshadowing for later today is that in many cases, this is how we ended up figuring out what the life cycle of the drug is and how do we create interventions that make sense in each of these areas. What we found is that we had 10 cases of theft that were internal, 2 cases of theft that were external. Someone from outside took advantage of an unlocked medication cart or something like that. And then 7 cases of tampering when we're looking at security of medications. And Mike is going to go through spotlight cases here.
So the spotlight cases are designed to just really talk through what we're talking about with the individual buckets. And so this one, facilities nursing staff observed that 16 tablets of residents' oxycodone were missing. Video evidence revealed the AP, the alleged perpetrator, walking in the hallway with the medication cart in hand. When that alleged perpetrator was talked with, they admitted to taking oxycodone. She stated she was having back pain and noticed the referencing narcotic medication was not locked in the narcotic drawer as usual. The alleged perpetrator stated when she saw the medications were in the wrong place, she was tempted and took the medication cart for her own use.
We see this a lot, and this is where our nurses or our providers or our medication techs, I think you all have those in Minnesota, correct? Licensed medication techs? Okay, or certified or something, okay. They are the ones who are pulling these drugs. What the literature says is that it's connected to the stress of the job. It's connected to a knowledge of drugs. So I know about oxycodone, I've given it a lot, and so we have tendency to self-medicate. I am a nurse, I'm allowed to say we, although I do not self-medicate like this, I use Dr. Pepper. And then some access to controlled substances. And this is the big one. It is a belief that my use can be controlled. And so I have given this enough that it feels like a comfortable drug. It doesn't feel like a big deal. I think for some nurses to say, I'm having back pain, if I give myself an oxycodone, I will feel better from my back pain, and I don't have to worry about addiction for me. And so that it's one of those things where the literature just keeps saying, people are comfortable, and so they're willing then to think about this.
Under theft, the alleged perpetrator was administering medications to a resident. The resident requested their pain medication several times before it was due. Later that evening, the alleged perpetrator was at the med cart with the resident, preparing to give the resident their Dilaudid. The resident stated they were going outside to smoke and did not want their pain medication. The AP shut the drawers of the cart but did not lock the drawer. The nurse walked away from the cart to attend to another resident for about 10 minutes. While the nurse was in another resident's room, another staff member saw the resident and a visitor take things from the medication cart and put them in their backpack. The nurse returned to the cart and discovered that the resident's Dilaudid tablets, 24 of those, were missing.
This is obviously a crime of opportunity, and as many times as we tell people to lock the medication cart, we walk down the hall and that medication cart is sometimes unlocked. The other piece of this, though, is that opportunity is also bears out with medical providers or nurses. What they say is when there is an opportunity, often that's when these things happen. And we saw that in article after article after article. The other piece of this, though, is we have a tendency then to have some compassion for people if they have addiction problems. We hear and we see in the literature that chemical dependency is a medical illness. And my favorite quote that I found on all of this is there is a U.S. district judge that says, addiction explains, but it never excuses. And so keeping that in mind as we start thinking through what do we need to do is that, yes, you may be addicted, and yet you still are not allowed to divert medication from our residents. You still are not allowed to do this. You're still not allowed to use in ways that you should not, and in ways that medications have not been prescribed to you.
Security and tampering. There were 7 cases in our review. The Spotlight case, 2 nurses completed a narcotic count and found hydrocodone tablets, cassette replaced with Tylenol. In addition, the liquid morphine solution appeared to have been tampered with. I need to use my adult voice. My apologies. So, in addition, the liquid morphine solution appeared to have been tampered with as the color was lighter. An investigation was initiated and all medication carts were inspected. The medication dosage cassettes were found to be tampered with. They included oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, and Ativan. The investigation determined 179 hydrocodone pills were replaced with Tylenol, 9 oxycodone pills were also replaced with Tylenol, 8 lorazepam pills were replaced with Lasix pills, and 1 bottle of liquid morphine had been replaced with water.
Lasix is a diuretic for those of you who are not clinical, so these people would be urinating rather than having pain control, just so you know. Tampering is one of those things that can be hidden for a long time. And what is hard about tampering is that it's hard to go back and figure out when this happened and how long pills in a card have been tampered with. And so the literature says diverters seem to favor tampering to outright theft, refilling syringes with water or saline after injecting an opioid if it's in a syringe. Heat sealers. And so it depends on the structure of a long-term care facility, but it's one of those things where they have seen people unseal and reseal cards in order to replace different pills in them. Card fixes and pills that look different, and so we have seen them slit and taped, or just slit and pulled out and something else put in. And then with the changes in stock meds, and that's something that we need to talk about, our pharmacies often have, in order to get us the meds that we need, sometimes there are problems with the distribution from different places. So they change manufacturers, and these pills start looking different. And so what I see coming in day after day after day looks like one thing. A new set of cards comes in, and I have a pill that looks a little bit different, and then another set of cards comes in, and the pill looks a little bit different. And so in the midst of this ever-changing distribution pattern, we're used to pills looking different, and it makes it so that we don't necessarily notice something that's been tampered. With the wide time frames and the multiple people that have access to these drugs, then you can't necessarily know when did this happen, what does this look like. And so the question is, I may look at a bottle of liquid and say, I still have all of the narcotic that I'm supposed to have for my hospice patient. And yet, I take off the top of that bottle of liquid and there are holes in the top of it. And all of a sudden, I don't know, I can look at how much is in there, I don't know actually what is in there. And so the question is, how do we keep those bottles safe, and how do we make sure that our counts actually look for tampering, not just the amount of liquid in the bottle? Administration and documentation. This is one where we see systems that don't communicate with each other. So we see people pulling out medications and documenting is administered but not actually giving the medication. And on the other side, we see people logging out the medication, and then there's no documentation for the administration that lines up with it. And so Mike's going to show you a few spotlight cases here that we found. This is a lot of cases.
So documented but not given, there was 15 cases. Our spotlight case, a MedTech knows that a narcotic documentation for a resident showed that the AP had documented administration of oxycodone greater than 3 hours after. My apologies again. I'm sorry.
Loud.
I will talk loud. We're used to small groups. We're from Colorado. My apologies. 3 hours after she had left her shift for the day. The MedTech reported that and the situation was investigated. The investigation revealed bulk diversion of oxycodone over multiple months. And our definition of bulk was over 500 tablets. Removed but not documented, 5 cases. The spotlight case, resident requested pain meds and nurse attempted to remove the pain meds from the passport system, which is an automated suspension system, but was notified that the removal was too soon. The nurse contacted the pharmacy and they were able to determine that the AP had retrieved the medication for the resident earlier in the evening. The AP was not working on that unit or neighborhood and was not assigned to that resident. A passport transaction report indicated the AP had retrieved narcotic pain medication from a medication dispensing machine for an additional 6 residents for a total of 350 tablets over a 4-month period. None of these tablets were documented as administered.
So often, diversion, what we found is that it affects our residents with conditions that make them vulnerable or unable to advocate for themselves. And so if I go in and ask, did you have your pain medication? This is someone who does not have the short-term memory to be able to tell me if they had their pain medication or if they did not. From a different case, the quote was that the alleged perpetrator would frequently request to work the memory care unit where staff stated that most of the residents had memory or cognitive issues and were unable to verify if they had increased pain or if they had requested pain medication. And in that case, bulk quantities of oxycodone were diverted there too. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of these big cases that happen over months with lots of pills were in places where we can't verify what happened specifically with our residents. Then we have resident transitions. This is one direct, and we're going to read you about the direct, but it seemed to be contributory to several different cases where they happened in the midst of some of that chaos of moving people from one place to another.
So the one case that we were going to highlight was one day of the incident. On the day of the incident, a resident was transferred from one rehab unit to another. During evening medication administration on the next unit, it was discovered that the resident's scheduled narcotics were missing. The facility immediately implemented a comprehensive search and completed their investigation. Based on video evidence, it was discovered the narcotics had been inadvertently left behind, and the AP found the narcotics were still in the cart. The AP admitted to taking the misplaced narcotics when she found them still present in the narcotic box. Destruction of waste. We have 3 cases. And what it's the big piece here was what does it mean to witness waste? We have the spotlight case multiple times when an AP would pull a drug and waste it with another nurse. In that process, they would document destruction with another nurse. On review, the medication that was put in the sharps container was a different drug, again Lasix, and the second nurse was not actually watching the destruction of an actual narcotic. They found bulk diversion of oxycodone over multiple months once this investigation was kicked off. As we looked across all of these different diversion cases, we wanted to look and see if there was a particular drug. We did find that one drug stood out, but again, we're seeing this shift, as you heard in the opening. Oxycodone stood out significantly. In all the multiple cases here, oxycodone was included. And then you can see the distribution all the way across.
So some additional vulnerabilities that we identified. There was a case where a long-term care facility had no mechanism in place to count Schedule III drugs. So they were counting their Schedule 1s, or Schedule 2s, not Schedule 1, their Schedule 2 drugs, but over 500 pills were diverted because they weren't counting all of their controlled substances. We had another nurse who, when they went back and looked at the background check that had been completed but not actually looked at by the facility, the person was under investigation for narcotic pump tampering at a hospital, but that had not been disclosed when they had been hired. There are some unique and creative approaches, and this one's kind of gross, but it's also something that happened. And there was a nurse who was pulling fentanyl patches off of his residents at 3 to 4 per shift, and he would put them in his mouth for an hour or 2, and then go back and put them back on his residents, and then go find another resident that had a fentanyl patch and pull it off and put it in his mouth. And this is not something that any of us, many of you guys are looking at me with disgust. I did not do this. But it's one of those things where when we think about unique or creative approaches, how in the world do you create a system where you can't do that? Because none of us would ever imagine that this could happen. And we wanted to highlight it because of the creativity. We also saw lack of follow-up in one of our long-term care centers in that we had a nurse who had been talked with 3 separate times, and it had all been documented, about her disproportionate use of narcotics and controlled substances for her residents. She was giving significantly more than her peers. She had a performance improvement plan in place that said that for every administration of a controlled substance, she was supposed to go find another nurse, and that the 2 of them were supposed to assess the resident together prior to administration. And in order to give her some understanding, let's assume good intent, and maybe say she was a bit over-aggressive in medicating the residents. And so if we do that, she was not following her performance improvement plan. And when they went back and looked at them and did the investigation in not following her performance improvement plan, there wasn't follow-up by the long-term care center, and she was diverting those drugs. The method of detection, I know this one is really hard to read, and so I'm going to read it to you. The first one is machine initiated. So there was some sort of automated dispensing machine that said, wait a minute, you need to look at this. Public notification, so someone from the outside called and said, go look at this. Residents, which I love that our residents are keeping an eye out for each other. Auditing, so I went in as a leader or someone went in as a leader and audited. Staff observation, drug visualization, narcotic counts, and then public reports. The other piece we need to think about is that we are only looking at 43 cases. And so the plural of anecdote is not data at this point. We have a sample size of 43 of these cases across 5 years, 6 years, 5 years in Minnesota. And so we have the data that we can find. It's better than not having anything. And yet, I think if we had, another 43 cases and doubled that N, we might find something a little bit different from a trend perspective. And so the other piece of this is how do we get good data? How do we make sure that we're collecting the right data so we understand the things that we need to look for?
So from our data and from the literature, there's infinite creativity when addiction is involved. And it can happen to any facility. We can have the best systems in place. We can have the best teams, but this can happen anywhere. And what we learn is we need to make a process where we're constantly vigilant to detect, and that involves all of our stakeholders, our patients, our residents, their families, everyone that's coming into our facilities. And we need to hardwire safeguards into our practices to decrease our vulnerabilities.
So we're going to look at our agenda really fast. We went a little fast on this first one because I think we're going to spend a little more time in the weeds as we go through our pathway a little bit later, and we wanted to make up a skosh of time. But we have our introduction that we did, our long-term care diversion landscape. We're next going to talk about the pathway structure and utilization. How did we create this structure? What does it look like? And how are we asking you all to start using this or looking at ways that it can be used, and what did we do? We're then going to take a 15-minute break. Yay! During that 15-minute break, we're going to hand out the drug diversion pathway. It's a lot of pages, and so we didn't necessarily want you guys to feel like you needed to be reading that as well as listening to us. And we're going to go through those pathway elements and the toolkit itself. What are the things that the team recommended that you all have in place in your homes? And how did we look at that? From there, we're going to give you guys about a 10-minute break. You will notice in the center of your tables, there are note cards and there are pens. We are having a panel discussion for the last about, hour or so of this. And so we want you guys, as you have questions and we go through this pathway and we go through implementation and what this could look like, as you have questions, grab one of those note cards and jot them down. We have a pharmacist who is going to come up here and sit on our panel. We have someone who is in charge of regulatory things at MDH who is here. We have someone who is a nurse and a nurse leader. And actually several of these people were part of putting things together. And we have someone who's from Elder Justice to talk through this from a resident-centered perspective. And so you can put who you want your question to be for, but you can also just ask questions. But we're going to walk through it from a panel discussion, what this looks like. As you have questions, write them down because we want to have plenty of things to talk about as we go along. And then at the end, we'll talk about some next steps. We started last fall to say, there is a problem. We know there is a problem of drug diversion. We know that everyone feels like they should be doing something, but the question is, what should we be doing? And then the question is there a pathway that we can follow? And so there's a quote that says, originally there is nothing, but as people walk this way again and again, the path appears. And I am a hiker. This is not one of my hiking pictures, but you can see the little path starting to appear as people walk this way again and again. And that path gets a little bit wider. And so what we want to make sure we do as we look at drug diversion across the state in long-term care is that we are gaining learning as you all walk this path again and again. How many of you all have personally had an occurrence somewhere in your career where you have had to manage drug diversion? Okay, look around you all, okay? We have a lot of experience in this room. And what we want to do is capture that experience in a way that we have a pathway to say, this is what we do in these cases, and these are the things we do to prevent these cases. We're going to look at the structure. How did we structure this? What assessment do I need to make at my long-term care facility when I go back of what do I have in place, what are some opportunities that we have, or what needs to be taken care of next week and what needs to be taken care of in the next quarter or the next 2 quarters, the next 6 months as we look at things. And then keeping in mind that everyone has different resources. If I went into each one of your homes, you all have a different structure from someone else. You have a different physical layout, physical plan, and where are your drugs stored? And how are they delivered to your home? And what does this look like? We know that there is no one-size-fits-all, go forth and fix this, and it'll work for everyone. And so we wanted to create flexibility for you all to say, these are the resources that we have, these are the vulnerabilities that we have, and this is what we're going to put into place. What we realized is that there are opportunities in prescribing and dispensing to make sure that that part of the drug life cycle is safe. Then we go down that drug life cycle and we look at procurement and delivery. As those medications are delivered to my home, are they safe in that process? We continue going down the path and we look at storage and security. Where do they go once they've been delivered? And is that process as clear as it should be? We then look at preparation and administration. What are my safeguards that I have in place to make sure that as I have people who have access to controlled substances, as they should, because they are taking care of the needs of our residents, how do we make sure that that's safe? I then want to look at our documentation process, and then we look at destruction and waste. That's our life cycle of our drugs that we've looked at. And so that's how, as we started talking, we decided to build this pathway. And for each one of these sections, we have interventions that you guys can look at that are suggested interventions to say, maybe I ought to look at putting these things in place in this area. You may look at this and say, procurement and delivery, we have that down. We are in great shape. They deliver it directly to a locked room. This is what happens. This is how we check in our medications. We're in great shape there. But when I look at our documentation systems, we don't have checks and balances, and we need to put those into place. You have the freedom to say, this is where we have the highest vulnerability. This is what I need to do next. The other piece of all of this, and we're going to continue talking about it, is we also know that you guys might be a skosh stretched from a time perspective, and that you might be juggling or balancing some different priorities. What we've done is we've actually created tools. So you have in our toolkit competencies that you can cut and paste out of there and put into your competency packet. We have content to go with those competencies that you can say, this 3/4 of this is already built for me, I just need to add these 4 sentences and we're good to go. You have information sheets, you have all sorts of tools, and we're going to go through those that we've already built for you. You are more than welcome to take them part and parcel, cut and paste, use them as you need to, and say someone did at least 75% of this work for me, I just have to do the last 25% getting across the finish line. And so we're going to talk about that. But here's our drug life cycle that we looked at all the way from prescribing and dispensing down to destruction and waste. Knowing then that we have hiring and management practices that we need to look at that cross that entire life cycle. We have education that needs to cross that entire life cycle. And then we have monitoring and investigation of that entire life cycle. And so we looked at this vertically, and then we looked at this horizontally. And the goal is to create a pathway that really has a pretty tight weave, and that we are able then to catch and create a net to make sure that diversion is not happening in each of our homes. Where we started with all of this, we looked at the drug life cycle, and then we came up with what are the interventions that people recommend, or what are the interventions that people have seen work. And our team sat down and threw a whole bunch of stuff up at the wall and said, what does this all look like? Let's do all 90 of these, right? And then we asked the question, are these effective? If I put this into place, would it be helpful? And then the next question is, how difficult would this be to put into place? Because if I do not have video surveillance in my home and I need to put in video surveillance in my home, that's difficult. It's resource intensive. It has some issues. And so that went a little higher on the difficulty level and the resource intensiveness level. On the other hand, one of the interventions was, can I interview my clinicians and ask them where they think there's vulnerability in the process? How hard is that? Well, it takes a little bit of time. On the other hand, it doesn't take resources. And it's a fairly easy intervention. Is it effective? Do my nurses know? Do my people know where there are vulnerabilities? They do. And so that one, came down on it's a little easier to put into place. It's not resource intensive. And so we came up with core interventions. These are things that should be fairly, I don't want to say easy, simple but not easy, maybe, to put into place. That I want to look at that core. And then if I have that core in place, I can go look at some advanced recommendations to say, ooh, this might work. Or as I am upgrading a specific neighborhood in my home, and we're buying new medication carts, this says that I might want to look at new biometric technology or proximity technology that as my nurses walk away from those med carts, they automatically lock. And so I don't have to keep reminding them to push that button in because I have new technology that works. And so this is an as I go forward and as we have resources and as we look at it, these are some things you might want to consider as we look at those advanced interventions. The toolkit has education. It has all staff education content. One of the things that we saw, and we will talk about this again, is that as your entire home, everyone who comes in generally has eyes and ears. They generally work. Depending, I think some of us have a little bit of low-level hearing loss. We grew up in the 80s with loudspeakers. But we have all staff education content in that everyone can have their eyes and ears open and know that diversion is an issue. And if I see something fishy, who do I go to and who do I talk to about that? We have orientation checklists and some demonstration competencies in there. We have draft letters to stakeholders. So some of these recommendations require you to have partnerships with your pharmacies. And where do I start having those conversations? You may have a pharmacist who you talk to. Please don't send them a draft letter if they're someone who you talk to all the time and you have a relationship with them. Grab that draft letter and use it as talking points and have a conversation. On the other hand, if you have a big pharmacy company where you don't necessarily have a point person and we want to ask them some specific questions, you have a draft letter that'll work. Some leadership guidance and education. How do I go about making sure that my investigations are effective? There's some information in there as well as several other things. And then equipment guidance. As I am looking at a new medication cart that has proximity technology, where do I even start with that process and what exists? There are some sheets of current technology that are there so you can kind of pull them out and it gives you some links for here are some current resources to look at. Now we know that those links will probably be updated over time, but for right now they're pretty current and it looks good. I probably ought to take this opportunity to say that the team and us, we have no preference in what equipment you buy. Go forth and buy equipment that works for you guys and for your resources. So there are some links in there that say here are some brands or here are whatever else. We are not recommending those brands. These are places to start and jump off and say, does this work for me? What the pathway is not, and we wanted to be very clear on this, is first of all, it's not something to overwhelm you. You are going to get 17 pages of pathway. Do not think, gosh, I don't know how I would even start with this. It is created as a resource of, here are some things I can try, here are some things I need to look at, I need to assess my home. But don't go forth and try to put in place all 17 pages of this pathway. The second is, it is not additional regulatory burden. The regulations have not changed, and well, they have not changed. I want to be very careful. Some things have passed in the last legislative session that have not changed. It's not as a result of this pathway. And what's interesting is we have recommendations in here that now all of a sudden are regulation. But this does not increase your regulatory burden. The goal is for this to help you. And it's not another new set of expectations. You are not going to have surveyors walk into your building and ask questions to say, have you done your assessment, and where is your assessment, and where are you in the implementation of such things? On the other hand, you can go back, when surveyors are there and they're asking you about medication security, you can say, here are the proactive things that we have put in. We have assessed our home, we have put into place, here's what we have done. And so I think that is a better place to do this. And there are no new FTAGs, obviously, from this, in that this is not an additional regulatory burden. How we want you to use the pathway. The first thing is read through it. It is 17 pages. built with love from a team across the state. The second is work with your teams to assess your home and ask some of those hard questions to say, where are we and what are our vulnerabilities? Once you've identified those vulnerabilities, you then want to pull out that area of that life cycle and say, what are some things that make sense for us to do? And you choose a manageable number of those interventions based on your resources. And we put one of these into place or two of these into place this quarter. And then you want to thoughtfully implement and ensure it's embedded. Once we know that those interventions are embedded, you can go back and repeat steps 1 through 5, where you assess, you read through it, you assess your home, you identify next vulnerabilities, and you go forth in creating progress over time. Just like you do with your cooperative process or API, depending on who you're talking to, in your homes all the time. As you do your assessment, number 1, know that your awareness that diversion is happening across the state and can happen in your home is the number 1 thing that can help decrease diversion. When people know that they are supposed to keep their eyes and ears open, when they know who they are supposed to talk to or how they are supposed to report if something seems fishy, they are much more able to do that. The second is, what's my risk? The third is, what are my context and resources? And the fourth is, what are my prioritization as you do your assessment? Then document your assessment. Look what we did, and you have that there, and make your plan. Who are my stakeholders? Who do I need to communicate with? What's the timeline to put this in? How do I know, you said it was going to go in, how do I know it actually went in and we're actually doing this? What are my outcomes, and then how are we going to evaluate and adjust? Because we will need to evaluate and adjust as we make our plan. And then we implement our plan. No home, not one of you guys, if we come back next year or in 2 years, will be able to implement the entire 17 pages, and we do not expect you to. We want you to go through and really identify and tailor, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's how we've seen things change as a result of the way that we have put things into place. And here is how we know that our residents are safer. So we are going to take a little bit of a break. You guys have 15 minutes. We are at 7 till, I believe, so we are going to reconvene, let's say at 10 after. The restrooms, as you go out these doors and go to the end of the hall, the restrooms are on your left, there's a big sign. Take your 15 minutes. We are going to, when you come back, your pathway is going to be on your table. So we'll get started actually on time at 10 after. Perfect. So as we look at the beginning of the pathway, there is the advisory group. This is the awesome team that's been meeting fairly often since December. Then we have how we are funded. We are a CMP, Civil Monetary Penalty Fund project. You can read about that if you would like. We have our introduction. We worked very hard on such things. And then we have the pathway structure on page 6. So we'd like you guys to start there as we go along. And it's what we looked at earlier, that horizontal and vertical, how do we even start looking at this process in a way that is systematic and in a way that makes sense. And so we're going to start for each one of these sections, there are core recommendations, and then there are advanced recommendations. And we're going to go through those and look at them. Again, remember, as you have questions, you have note cards. And so if there are specific areas, I'll actually know if I'm not being clear, because everybody will be reaching for the center of the table to try and find their note card. So we can talk about it a little bit later, but that will help us a lot. So for prescribing and dispensing, The very first core recommendation says that the facility has implemented quality limits on prescriptions, including prescription length, quantity, and dosing ranges for controlled substances. So what we don't want is for someone to come into your home from their hip surgery and have their PRN, narcotic medication for their hip surgery, then continue in perpetuity for the next 6 months as they go off of that and just have that sitting in your car. The rationale is when a prescription continues without review, it is more likely for it to be inappropriate for a resident's condition. We want to know that the medications that someone has aligns with the condition that they have and that it makes sense for what's going on. The second is the facility has a process in place to review and discontinue PRN controlled substances that have not been administered in greater than 30 days. And what I would like for you guys to see in that is the parentheses, unless there is a resident-centered rationale for continuation. If there is a reason why that needs to be there, document the reason, but we want to know that you all have reviewed it and that there is a good reason why each one of those PRN controlled substance medications is in place. What we also know is that when there is a PRN narcotic or a PRN controlled substance that is not being used and it just sort of sits there and gets counted over and over, it becomes a little more invisible every time it gets counted, right? We can say, and this is so-and-so's this is still in the cart, and just kind of keep flipping through it. It's more stuff to count, and it's more stuff to just sort of be there and be background noise. And so we really want to decrease the background noise and make sure that we are operating in intent. The third is that the facility contracts with a pharmacy, and there are about 4 of these. These are pharmacy interventions that we want to partner with our pharmacies to say, is there a way that you can do this to make this either easier for our facility, or B, that you can do this because it helps with the safety of our residents. The facility contracts with the pharmacy that is able to provide a description of the controlled substance being dispensed as a part of the labeling process. If the labeling process says this is a small white pill that has this on one side and this on one side, all of a sudden when I'm counting, I can look and say, wait, it's supposed to be a blue pill, but it is a white pill in here. What just happened? And so we can have a discussion about what that looks like. The other thing that's rather interesting about this and where this helps is we had at one point in a facility where I was working, someone dispensed, if I remember right, 25 milligrams of Haldol instead of 2.5 milligrams of Haldol. And when we have, this is what this is supposed to look like, all of a sudden it looks a whole lot different. But giving someone 10 times the dose is not good. And knowing that what that pill is supposed to look like helps with that process. The next one, the facility contracts with the pharmacy that will communicate appearance changes when there is a brand or manufacturing change for controlled substances. We don't say what this communication needs to look like. But if this medication has been coming in as a red tablet and it is now coming in as a green capsule, having a process for that to be communicated, to be able to say, this is what this now looks like coming from our pharmacy because this is what we were able to get. There's a national shortage of whatever there is a national shortage of. This is why we've changed this, or this is how we have changed this. If I have a very standardized communication for that, I then, as a nurse, am able to look and say, wait a minute, that's the way that's supposed to be, instead of just saying that looks different, but it always looks different. And so we can look and say, is that the way it's supposed to be? The facility has a policy whereby only the provider who has ordered a medication can sign the physical prescription. When a facility culture exists where providers cover for one another by signing orders, there's more opportunity for error and diversion. Many of you are looking at me going, why in the world would we need this? We have one provider, we have 2 providers, and they come in, they take care of their people. There are homes that have 20 or 30 or have a residency program or have some other pieces like this where the culture has developed in a way where it's acceptable for multiple people to sign for a prescription that they did not get. And so if that is your home, it's worth stopping and taking a few steps back and saying, wait a minute, that's probably not a healthy way for us to be operating at this point. The facility institutes a 2-nurse sign-off process for all urgent emergent medication orders. Now, some of you all have 1 nurse on at a time, overnight or something like that. At this point, a 2-nurse sign-off process might not work for you, right? That is why it is an advanced recommendation. So if you have the process, if you have a nursing supervisor, if you have something like that, and when you get into the e-kit, you can have 2 people look at that medication and do that, that's one thing. If you don't have the resources to be able to do this, you say this one is not feasible for us, and you move on and find something else that might be. Or you say, what is another way we can reach the intent of this intervention to make sure to do this? So when nursing resources are available for this intervention, the process improves controlled substance security for emergency medication. Because we have 2 sets of eyes on it, and we don't have someone pulling stuff from the e-kit. The facility institutes a review process for all emergency medication orders. We go back and look at what happened and why did we need an emergency medication. Emergency medications are at high-risk area for diversion. Reviewing all of those decreases the opportunity to abuse emergency medication availability. So if I have a process that makes it easy for people to grab those meds, and I call the doc, and the doc's like, yep, give them to whatever it is that I'm giving them, and we don't go back and loop back around, it might be an easy way that someone's taking advantage of your process. And then the facility contracts and sets up a process with a pharmacy that is able to complete partial fills according to the Board of Pharmacy and DEA rules when appropriate. And I know that the Board of Pharmacy rules have changed a little bit in this area in Minnesota. But the thought is, if someone has a really low burn rate on their controlled substances, instead of dispensing 30 tablets, 30 something, or 2 months worth or 3 months worth or whatever that looks like, if someone uses 1 tablet once a week for their dressing change or twice a week for their dressing change, there is no reason for us to be keeping a huge amount of controlled substance on hand. So while I may have a prescription, knowing that they have a slow healing wound that's going to be there for the next 6 months, and we're going to give them 2 doses of controlled substance every week for now until that wound goes away, that's an appropriate prescription. On the other hand, if we can decrease it so that we're not keeping a ton of narcotic on hand, it's helpful. So as we look at this, our toolkit, what is available for prescribing and dispensing, is a draft letter to the medical director or providers to say these are the changes that we are recommending or that we are putting into place for our home, and we're requesting your partnership, and a draft letter to pharmacy to say these are the things that we're requesting. You guys may look at that and say we're only doing one of these, so cut out the rest of the text and just send the one change that you're making, whatever that looks like. But all of those changes are embedded in those draft letters. And then we want you all sharing information with your staff as you implement these things. We're moving on to procurement and delivery. Look how fast this is happening. We're tearing through this toolkit. Procurement and delivery. The first one is the facility has a process where controlled substances are delivered directly to the nursing staff and ensures that medications are never left unattended. So I am a courier, or I am someone working for FedEx or something like that, and I come into a home and no one is at the nurse's station, and I don't know what to do with this, so I leave I know I need a signature, but I can't find someone, or I flag someone down for a signature, and they're like, I guess I can do this, and all of a sudden we have someone who has a box full of meds wandering around the facility. If, however, we have a process, so they come in, and the receptionist or someone sitting there or someone in their office has a sign or something that says all prescription medications need to be delivered to the nurse's station. And then we figure if there is still a nurse's station at your home, many of you may have removed such things. And then we have this is the place. Now the second piece of all of this that we cannot have is our clinicians, when they see the FedEx driver, saying, oh, I can't do that right now, and we have someone sitting there for 30 minutes. So we have to create a process in our home that works for everyone. And the draft letter to the delivery services says, these are the things, and if it's not working for you, here's the person to talk to, because we want to create a system that actually is functional and actually works. But if that then goes, nurses then can secure that shipment immediately, ensuring security of controlled substances and keeping that chain of custody intact. So the goal is we deliver it to someone who knows exactly where it goes and how to get it locked up immediately, so we don't have a box of unsecured meds hanging out. The facility has a process for 2 staff check-ins of medications. One individual must be a nurse or pharmacist, and the other individual must receive training on the check-in process. As you might know, we have that training available for you as a part of this toolkit. So here are the things that you might want to think about if you are someone who is a CNA who's being trained in checking of medications. But we want two sets of eyes on this, so one person is never just solely, completely in charge of checking in a large amount of medications that come into your home. It decreases error and it decreases opportunity for diversion in that case. Oh gosh, this card went away, or this card never was delivered. The facility uses an electronic process or bound logbooks for tracking of controlled substances in each cart. The number of times we go to a cart and there's a 3-ring binder with all sorts of loose leaf papers that then have been flipped through at every count, and then they have been reinforced with the 3-hole punch reinforcement thingies, and they still are kind of coming out because it's been there for forever and it's been flipped through. In the midst of that, there is absolute opportunity for one of those pages to come out and get lost. There is absolute opportunity for me to crush up a page and put some lovely reinforcement things on it and to make it change things, right? And so if we have a bound logbook that has numbered pages, that things we absolutely can tell if something has fallen out, has been put back in, those things, it increases our security. And so we want you all having something where you can absolutely tell that it has been tampered with. The next, the facility contracts with the pharmacy that will communicate appearance changes when there is brand manufacturing change. We already have this. I don't know why it didn't get moved, sorry. The facility contracts with the pharmacy who is able to provide labeling that facilitates clinicians checking in medication. This may be in the form of a pre-printed adhesive label to place in logbooks or providing electronic support such as barcodes to facilitate the home's electronic process. So as we come in and I take my bound logbook and I have to manually write out the resident's name and manually write out that this is the medication that they are on and manually write out that this is the dose and manually write out that this is the number of tablets and I need to rather rinse repeat with another 6 residents, that takes a lot of my time, right? On the other hand, if the pharmacy has a template and is able, as a part of that process, to just print up something that actually fits in your logbook that has all of those things and we can pull it out and get it stuck in, no longer is checking in meds going to take me 20 minutes. It is now going to take me 3 minutes, and I can get those meds exactly where they need to be. And so the thought is, how do we work with our pharmacies to say this is what our logbooks look like, or this is what our electronic process is as we move forward. We're trying to make these recommendations as evergreen as we can. We do not know what the electronic process will look like 5 years from now. But we know that if we are working with our pharmacies to say this is our process and this is what you could do to make this easy and make it work for us so that we're not manually copying, that's an unbelievably good thing. Our advanced recommendations for this. The facility has worked with its affiliate hospital and local providers to create a process where there are no hard copies of prescriptions sent to the nursing facility. One of the things we saw in the literature over and over and over again, and we have heard that this is being fixed, but there is some sort of packet that comes from the hospital that has these hard copies of prescriptions, and weirdly enough, those hard copies of prescriptions sometimes don't make it into our facility. And we don't know if that happens in transport, we don't know if that happens on the front end from the hospital perspective, and we don't know if it happened on the back end at my facility. But somewhere in that process, that hard copy that was supposed to be there is no longer there. And so what I do as the resident-centered thing is I pick up the phone and I call the doctor and I get, or the provider, and I get the right prescription for my resident who needs this controlled substance. But at that point, how do we follow where did that hard prescription go? We're not 100% sure. And so the recommendation is that we just don't have hard copies of prescriptions. The toolkit that we have, a draft letter to the delivery service, a draft letter to pharmacy. Again, take them, do with them what you will, make them work for you. They can also be used as talking points. After hours or small facility controlled substance checking competency. If we have 2 people doing that check-in, what do I need to know to make sure that we're doing this the right way? And then we have a bound controlled substance tracking logbook information sheet for those of you who have the 3-ring binders on your card. It has a, here are the characteristics that we believe will help with the bound logbook that we are asking you guys to take care of. Okay, storage and security. We are so fast. Number 1, controlled substances are double blocked, including the refrigerators. Now, are hoping that all of you already have this in place and that it is taken care of. On the other hand, if it is not, please go back and look at your locking mechanism to see what you need to do. I have actually been at a Walmart buying a gun safe that then went in and tied into a refrigerator to get this taken care of at one of our facilities that we realized didn't have a double locking process. And the gun safe worked. It was kind of amazing. But do what you need to do to get your guards locked up appropriately. Counts are completed consistently at every handoff of care. Now, this is not are you completing counts, this is that they are consistent. What we actually want, we have a demonstration competency for counts. I think people do it so often that they get absolutely lackadaisical about there are 17 of Mrs. So-and-so's whatever, there are 14 of this, there's 13 of this, there's 10 of this. And they miss some of the points of these are the pieces that we're actually supposed to be looking at. And so we put together a count competency for people to actually demonstrate and say, this is why we do this in this specific way. One of the things we talked about over and over this morning was tampering, and that people have a tendency to come up with some very creative ways to make their meds look interesting. One of the things we want our nurses to be doing, or our people who are counting to be doing, is to be checking for tampering at every single count. And so how do we do that in a way that's efficient? There's competency, and we'll let you guys look at that and say this makes sense. The other piece that the competency addresses is the fact that I can look at you, and I can move now. If you're the friend, I'm sorry. But I can look at you and say, this is 17 of Mrs. So-and-so's thing, and your job then would be to say, What we want is for us to not have confirmation bias in this case. So I'm the one documenting, and you're the one counting, and vice versa. We want independent counts. We don't want someone saying, And so we have to really think through how does this work in a way that you're counting and I'm counting, and the communication happens in a really standardized way and the documentation happens in a really standardized way, so that we're not just seeing what we want to see and saying, yep, that's what I see. So sorry, I don't think I spat on you. I think we're okay. Counts are completed consistently, and effective counts follow a chain of custody philosophy. Counts include a process to monitor for tampering. I already talked about that. The facility has a process for handoff security, key, biometrics, or access devices. So secure medication stored is dependent on medications being securely stored with tight control of access. The number of times I have walked in a facility and I have seen keys laying around all sorts of places, or, I have this key and I have this key and it's supposed to be in 2 different places and yet I have access to everything, is legion. And so the question is, have we really actually sat down and intentionally thought through the security of our medications in a way where it would be difficult for me to have access to everything and for me to not be responsible? So I want to think through what are my handoff processes, and if I can, force that function a little bit. So say I do have a med cart with biometrics, or I have an automated dispensing machine, or we have the passport system or something like that. Is there a way that I can actually tell that someone pulled this out outside of their shift? Is there a way technologically that we can put in, this is what this person is supposed to have access to? A process is in place to address discrepancies 24 hours per day. You will see this in 2 separate places. But what we don't want is something happening at 2 in the morning, and nobody talks about it again until 10 o'clock that morning when it comes up in our morning huddle or our morning meeting. And oh yeah, there are 2, I don't know, Dilaudid tablets missing from this neighborhood in our facility. The longer that gap is there, the less likely we are to be able to figure out what happened to those 2 pills. And so whatever that looks like, some of you all who are in smaller facilities, the buck stops here in that, I made a phone call at a time that I do not want to take a phone call. Some of you all, you may have a nursing supervisor. Is that nursing supervisor trained to start this process? What is the chain of command? And does everyone know if something is wrong, if there is a discrepancy? That's not something that I sit on, that's not something I wait for. I don't go home if I'm in a count where there's a discrepancy. What is the process in my home, and do I know what to do 24 hours a day if something happens? our advanced recommendations. Controlled substance doses are supplied in unit dose when available and in the smallest dose possible when unit dose is not available. This has financial implications, right? Because when I have something that is a bulk medication, it's much easier and often much less expensive. On the other hand, that bulk medication is vulnerable to tampering. And so when I can use a unit dose, the recommendation is that we do. What that looks like for you all is to sit down and look at what are the meds that my pharmacy, with my pharmacist, what are the meds that they have, and what are we at highest risk for? Can those be ordered in unit dose? And what would the financial implications be for us? And is that something that's worth it for our home in order to make this more secure? This next one, it's an advanced recommendation. We talked about it. The facility invests in video surveillance equipment around places where controlled substances are stored and dispensed following all law and regulation for video monitoring. You will notice this morning in our case studies that we talked about, I believe 3 of them said, upon looking at the video, it was found that the alleged perpetrator had the cards in her hand, had this, had that. Video surveillance is unbelievably helpful for us to be able to go back and figure out and piece together what happened as part of the investigation, if we can do it. And so if you want to go look at the laws and regulation, if you all are doing this, you can look at the resources for your facility and you can say, is this something that makes sense for us to do, and where would we do it, and what would the cost be? And really being able to sit down and ask some of those questions, because it is unbelievably helpful on the tail end to figure out what happened. The next one, the facility invests in automated dispensing machines with biometrics and blind counts for all controlled substance administration. They create blind counts which are safer, more efficient, and reliable than manual counting of controlled substances. We can decrease some of that time that we are spending doing counts every single shift because the handoff of care happens whenever we open that specific drawer for that specific med. Now, some of you guys are looking at me like I am on crack. I am not. We have put automated dispensing machines in long-term care facilities. I will say that some of them, the price of them are coming down significantly, and there's some new technology that is making them so that they are affordable in long-term care. The blind count may be worth it, and you guys may decide you need a small one for your facility. You need one in this area of your facility. This is something for you all to have a discussion about, but know that it is something that we're seeing across the country that people are doing because of the increased security. I will also say, so probably too much on automated dispensing machines. You might be able to tell that I'm a fan of that blind counting and of the not manual over and over and over counting. But when we put this into a facility, we have nurses come to us and say, there's no way on earth I can go to the ADM every time I need to administer a controlled substance. I just don't have time to do it. And I will also say that it did not affect their workflow nearly as much as they thought it would. And we went back in and they were like, you know what, it really is okay, it's not a big deal. And I thought it was going to be a big deal. So, which was surprising to me because these were nurses who didn't think a lot of things were not a big deal. So, know that it is doable, don't just discount it. On the other hand, it might not be the right thing for your home. It's worth a look at. The facility invests in medication cards with biometrics to unlock access to controlled substances. And so having that fingerprint, I know that the person with the fingerprint was there when this was open, and then it is their responsibility to close. Also, the proximity of being able to lock when people walk away is huge. When I have a resident, do I let my resident fall or do I lock my med cart? Sometimes it's down between those. How do we make that choice? It's not a good choice to have to make. When a facility operates on 12-hour shifts, the facility takes additional care when the same 2 nurses are scheduled back to back to back for several days. As a nurse taking care of residents and patients, I loved it when I could just hand things back to the same nurse. Here's what changed over my 12 hours. You're taking them for the next 12 hours. I'm taking them for the next 12 hours. It is phenomenally efficient because they know my residents and I know my residents, and we can just talk about changes. Where we lose efficiency, what we gain in efficiency, though, we lose in taking care sometimes in that count. And so I can look back over the last 72 hours, and it's been 2 people who have had an eye on those medications for 72 hours, and now I have a problem. And while often it's those 2 people, I know if something happened in those 72 hours. If we lose some of the carefulness in that quick pass off, we have some problems. I don't know what this looks like. I know people, when we started talking about this, there was some apprehension of, well, of course we use 12-hour shifts, and of course people go back and forth and back and forth. It's worth looking at, do we need to have an extra count somewhere in the middle of that in order to keep security? So our toolkit, controlled substance count demonstration competency. There is content and there is a checkoff. Medication card security information sheet. If you guys are looking at new med carts, you can look at that. Automated dispensing machine information sheet. If that seems something interesting, you can look at that. We are over halfway through, it looks like, or right around halfway through. Preparation and administration. Number one, nurses are educated on the proper way to prepare, administer, and document controlled substances and the rationale behind the process that ensures safety. We assume that you all are doing this as a part of your orientation, but we want to make sure. And so there is a competency for administering all the way through wasting, and we're going to talk about the term wasting in just a minute. But looking at that and saying, are we properly training our nurses or anyone who is administering medication in our home as to why they're doing the things that they're doing, not just how they do the things that they're doing. Next one, facility leadership interviews nurses and clinicians to identify facility-specific areas of vulnerability. When I go into homes and ask questions, nurses, they love this. They'll say, wait, you want to know where we're vulnerable? I'll tell you where we're vulnerable. And they'll start telling me, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. They're really great at telling you what is wrong. And so we want to avoid that just a little bit. The other thing we want to avoid is, you're here, I'm sorry. I'm interviewing her, and I'm asking questions, and she's saying there's a huge problem with our practice in this area, in this area, in this area, and it's creating vulnerability. And I say, well, it's because you're doing it wrong. And I take this as a teachable moment in my head, but all of a sudden I have made it so that she is never going to talk to me again when I ask her about what's wrong, because she's now in trouble because she's not following our process. So when we do this interview, I want you guys to find the least intimidating person on your leadership team. I want them to train themselves in biting their tongues. And I want them just to ask and say, where are some places where you think that we possibly could be vulnerable? And if they are not following process, you nod at them and say, that's a really good point. And then we go on to the next person, and we document. Now, I then at the next staff meeting can come back and say, it has come to my attention that we may not understand the process that we're supposed to be following, so let's go through that again. But what we don't want to do is make her in trouble for talking to me and telling me what's wrong in the facility. And so your job is to bite your tongue and nod and smile and take copious notes if you are the person interviewing. And you're just going to ask lots and lots of questions. We have a template for you to ask some of those questions, but you'll be amazed when people don't feel like they're going to get in trouble, but they'll tell you this is what we're doing. One of the other things we found when we looked at the investigations, there were two of them that stood out to me like a sore thumb. In that the alleged perpetrator in this case did not get into any trouble. Now the home, their process was in a little bit of trouble, and the reason why is the investigator took the time to go ask 3 or 4 other nurses in the facility, what do you do in this case? And they said, well, we do this, we do this, we do this. Every single person was doing it in the exact same way. They were doing it in the way that they had been trained, and yet the way that they had been trained had so many gaping holes in it that created opportunity for bad things to happen. Because everybody was doing it as they had been trained, yes, there were gaping holes, but that individual did not get in trouble. That individual wasn't diverting medications, but there were problems in reconciling medications. The interview is for you guys to ask some of those questions to say, is our process clean? Is everyone following the same process? And are there vulnerabilities in this process? And you'll be amazed because we can look at this then from a systems perspective, not from an individual perspective. And we can look at this from a training perspective of, the number of times I have heard leadership and maybe has come out of my mouth of, well, they're supposed to be doing it this way, but they're not. Well, they should know this. They might not. And so we want to ask those questions to see what are the things that I assume they're doing right. What are the things that are as clear as day to me as a leader that this is what they're supposed to be doing, but they may either not know it or practice has become lax, that it's just become culture. This is what we do, and you have a safety hole. The facility completes core quality reviews of controlled substance administration on a schedule, looking for outliers. Now, we did not tell you what this schedule needed to look like. We didn't tell you what this necessarily needs to look like from a quality review. I will say that this is how we have found the vast majority of people proactively who are diverting across the homes that I have worked with. As we've sat down and we've looked at doses of narcotic administered, and we've started looking for funny patterns. And sometimes those patterns stick out to you like a sore thumb, some of them don't. If you have an electronic health record, you may be able to just print up what are all the controlled substances that have been given. And all of a sudden you'll realize that there's a nurse who was given 500 more doses last month than any of the other nurses. And you start asking some questions, and it may make sense. This nurse may have, this resident at this time when they need additional medication. If I can make it make sense, or if it makes sense, it makes sense. Sometimes it stops making sense. And so what we're looking for is someone who's giving significantly more narcotics, someone who is giving different narcotics than other people. Or the last one that we found, there are two that stick out, but the last one we found, she was the only nurse that was giving narcotic to 4 different residents. And those 4 different residents didn't receive narcotic from anyone else, but almost every time this nurse worked, those 4 residents got narcotics. So we started going in and talking to those residents. And they were not receiving narcotic from that nurse. And so we can go back and look at our administrations and start looking for patterns in whatever way that makes sense for you and your goal. The advanced recommendations. The facility creates a system to track, compare, and analyze controlled substance administration patterns of nurses on a quarterly schedule. If you have the time and the resources to be able to do this, or you have an EHR where you can print this up, or you can look and say, we're going to do it every 3 months. Instead of the first one gave you it just says you're going to complete a quality review, figure out your time schedule, figure out how you're going to do it. The second one says this is what we need to look at. You can look at standard deviations for your administration of meds. You can look at statistical reports. You can look at a lot of things. And so you want to look at your resources. You want to look at your knowledge. You want to look at your ability to use Excel. Or find someone who can use Excel for you to be able to really run some of those reports and dig down and figure it out. The other thing that we figured out when we did this, which was fascinating, is we had 2 homes, one of which for the entire previous month had given 64 doses of controlled substance, and that was all. One of our homes had given, I think, and they were the same size home, had given, I believe, over 2,000 doses in the exact same size home. And so the question is, one of them was moving people towards scheduled, or it was PRN doses, sorry, let me be very clear on that. But one of them had been moving people towards scheduled doses, had been really looking at, do people need these controlled substances, and maybe had fallen a little too hard on the no. The other one was handing them out as if they were candy. And so it also helped us have a discussion with our providers to say, you may be administering a little too much narcotic. We don't want to question your medical judgment, but in comparison to your peers, holy cow, this is a lot. What's going on with your specific facility? And in his case, he was, when we addressed it with him, he was absolutely open to it. He said, I just have had a free hand with some of these guys because they were veterans and he had a soft place for them in his heart and he just wanted them to be without pain. And so he was writing a lot of pain meds. The facility invests in medication cart with proximity card readers that lock when the nurse walks away from them. I have mentioned that a couple of times. And then our toolkit in here, controlled substance orientation checklist. This is for things that you don't necessarily need a demonstration competency on, but we want to make sure people cover them in orientation. My guess is that many of you have some checklists. This is things that we want to make sure are covered. The competency, content, and checkoff, these are the things that people need to demonstrate. Proactive staff safety interview guidance document. Here are some questions you might want to ask. When you go have that conversation with your staff, or when when your person who is assigned to go do that does that. Controlled substance administration review guidance document. So if you are thinking, I want to go in and do one of those quality reviews, here are some things that might be helpful to look at. And then a medication card security information sheet. This is, med cards that are on the market that might be helpful in these cases. Documentation. The facility has clear and efficient, non-duplicative substantive standards for documentation of controlled substances. One of the things we have realized is that in long-term care, many times people are documenting controlled substances in 3 different places, depending on, I need to pull it out of the cart and document that it's no longer in the cart, I need to document it in the medical record, I need to document it over here and over here. And in doing so, sometimes people are missing one of those, or it becomes, there are so many check marks to do that it makes it really difficult to make sure that my documentation is complete. So we want to really think through, is my process clear? Are there multiple standards? And, you know, are we in a place where we can just do this 1 time or 2 times? What makes the most sense to document? The facility has clearly communicated professional standards for nursing and documentation. And this one, we struggled a little bit when we had this discussion, because do we need to tell nurses that they're nurses? And we don't know the answer to that. I think it depends a little bit on the culture in your facility. And yet, state rules create standards that must be followed as a part of nursing practice. And so as we set up our culture, are your nurses proud to be nurses? Are they proud to be making sure that they are keeping those residents safe? Do they see administration of controlled substances as something that they do both to take care of their residents and to keep people safe and those security measures as a part of their nursing role? And so the question is, do we need to have that conversation with your nurses or do I not? It's really up to you guys from a culture perspective. The facility has designed a process whereby documentation discrepancies are reported and addressed when they are discovered. So sometimes there's a documentation discrepancy. I can go back and figure out what happened. So I go back and say, well, this happened to her, and this happened to her, and this is what happened, and this is where that pill is, and this is where we are in this process. In those cases, a lot of times we just check the box. We figured it out, and we're good to go. And the question is, should we go back and say what happened if that keeps happening over and over and over again, where I have to go play Blue's Clues and figure it out, and then I go play Blue's Clues again and figure it out, and again? We may have a process that is broken, that we can fix that process, and no longer have to go back and figure out what happened to the medication or what happened to the documentation, and how do we make it all line up. Our advanced recommendation: the facility uses reports generated from their electronic health record to assist in finding patterns and aberration in controlled substance administration. If you have an electronic health record, we want to ask your people, if you don't know how to run those reports, start asking questions. What reports are available? How can I run them? What does this look like? Because the more we can decrease manually, you trying to figure it out, the more efficient you all can be. The other piece of this, for those, how many of you guys do not have electronic health records? Not that many, okay. So I probably don't need to talk about this. There are also ways to force functions if you do not have an electronic health record. And so in those cases, you may have your individuals fill out one additional thing at the end of every shift of how many controlled substances did I administer the shift, or how many things are on my count log. And it helps you then be able to force that function a little bit to start being able to do this without someone going in and manually counting all of those administrations. So our toolkit is controlled substance administration, documentation, and waste competency content and checkoff, and then the investigation guidance document. The investigation guidance document goes along with an investigation sheet that you can fill out with a standardized data set that we are really looking to talk with our surveyors so that they're making sure they get that data set. So if you know that when they walk in your building, they're going to be asked if something awful should happen, they are going to be asking for these 25 pieces of information, having the time ahead of time as we call and wait for all of that investigation to trigger, to really be able to gather that data ahead of time, makes you feel a little, first of all, you have the pit in your stomach because something awful happened, but it might make you feel a little bit better of, I know how to investigate this, and I know how to ask the right questions. We have someone who does a ton of investigations sitting on this panel coming up, so if you have questions about how to do that well, that may be something that you write down on your pathway questions. Destruction and waste. The facility has clear elements defined when a dose of medication must be destroyed and a clearly defined process and a timeline for destruction. The clear process eliminates the opportunity for controlled substances intended for destruction to disappear or be forgotten. This includes doses or medications not administered, discontinued prescriptions, and expired medications. So does everybody know this should no longer be in my cart, or we dropped it on the floor, or whatever it is, this is intended for destruction. What do we do with that? The facility has secure storage for controlled substances that cannot be destroyed immediately. If there is not a way to destroy this immediately, what do I do to make sure that's secured in the meantime and that it's not sitting there for a long time? The facility, this one we talked a lot about too, so we can have a discussion about it. The facility has made an effort to change waste vocabulary to clearly delineate why medication is being destroyed. What they found in the literature, and this was fascinating to me, is that nurses will tell you when they are caught diverting. Some of them will say, well, it was just being wasted anyway. And it wasn't, yes, there's this thing of if it's wasted, then I can recycle it. Sort of a feeling of reduce, reuse, recycle, or something like that. There is also a piece of this where nurses sometimes hesitate to waste. So I gave someone a half a dose. That was part of something that I could do. I could give them half a pill, but they may want that second half a pill in 3 hours. And what a tremendous waste for this half a pill. So I'm just gonna stick it in my scrub pocket, and I'm gonna walk around with it for the next however many hours, just in case in 4 hours this person wants their next dose. And so it's all over the place, and either this half pill falls out of my pocket when I reach in for something else, or I go home and I now have a half pill in my pocket, or whatever it is. We have seen, in some ways, this feels unbelievably irresponsible, but when you talk to nurses, and when we look at the rest of our culture, we don't want to waste anything. And so that remaining part of a dose, because I call it waste, all of a sudden it feels like I should not be wasting that. And so clinicians can rationalize that they are not causing harm by diverting controlled substance that would be wasted anyway. On the other hand, when we call it destruction of a partially used dose or destruction of a dispensed dose that was unable to be administered, for some reason changing the vocabulary has a tendency to change the way we view this. So it's a weird thing. You guys can decide whether or not you want to do it. My guess is if you try to put this in place, you will have a lot of nurses rolling their eyes a little bit. But after doing it for a while, it might become something that helps with that mental, here is why we are putting this where we are putting this. The facility has a clear process indicating the elements required to sign for waste. The number of nurses who are so busy, who then say, hey, can you sign off for my this that I wasted, and can you sign off for my this that was wasted, and oh, you know, the fentanyl went somewhere else. We saw a lot of these cases when we did the investigation. And so clinicians can feel pressure to sign for waste they have not witnessed when there is not a clear standard. When clinicians understand the professional standard, they're less willing to trust us on that. So in order for me to sign for waste, I've been oriented that these are the 3 elements that I need to have witnessed this, I need to have seen this, and I need to have seen this. And if I do that, I'm allowed to sign for it. The next piece of this, though, is that the facility has a clear process for clinicians to follow when elements required to sign for waste have not been met. I was a hospital nurse. I was giving a large dose of narcotic in a little clear vial. And I was a fairly new nurse, and I had been taught that if I injected air into the vial, it helped everything come out. And in my head, as a new nurse, in a hurry, I was trying to get the medication out of the vial. I needed someone who needed that medication. So I injected a lot of air, and there was a little stopper at the end. And all of a sudden, there was Dilaudid on the ceiling. There was Dilaudid on the counter. There was Dilaudid everywhere. And I sat there and thought, I literally do not know what to do. And so I did what every other nurse would do, is I found my buddy on the floor, and I went and pulled her to it, and I was like, that is Dilaudid, and that is Dilaudid. And in my head, that's wasted, and we're going to clean this up with paper towels. But it was one of those things where she had to trust my character, and she had to trust that she knew me, that was Dilaudid. Now, if I was a brilliant nurse, I knew I was not under video surveillance at the time, this was a lot of years ago, I could have spilled some saline on the counter, spilled some saline here, pocketed a Dilaudid vial, and all of a sudden gone home with a nice big dose, right? And I didn't. But in my head, I was pondering all of these things, and yet the nurse had to trust me when she came, because there was literally no system for me to grab management at that point and be like, that's allotted and that's allotted and this is not what we do when we waste things, but it's certainly wasted and I can't recover it. And so what do we do and what systems do we have in place when things don't work? And so I may have, someone who is spitting out their medications, and so there's morphine all over a hospital gown and there's morphine on the floor. And how do I account for that when this person still needs their morphine and we still need to administer it, but now we have multiple doses? And so the question is, do I have a process when the elements required to sign for waste have not been met? So I'm not finding my buddy nurse who just signs it and does me a favor, but we actually document this happened and it was weird and this is why it was weird and we can tell the truth about it instead of saying we just need to take care of this so that I don't fight on a documentation audit somewhat. Advanced recommendation. The facility invests in medication disposal system that immediately destroys unused doses and meets EPA requirements. There are a ton of these out there now. So some of you guys have cactus sinks, some of you guys have MedSafe, some of you guys are using the bottles, and it doesn't really matter. The question is, does it meet the requirements that we need, and can I immediately get things so that they cannot be administered? The stockpile decreases security. The facility creates a process where unique individuals are involved in the CS destruction process. We were in a place in rural Colorado, and the DON would grab her ADON every single month with a 30-day supply of waste. They did not have the immediate destruction stuff. And they'd go into a back room and close the door and lock the door, or close the door behind them and automatically locked. And the two of them every month had their ritual where the two of us are the only people who waste medications. We go behind a closed door, they waste all of the month's medication. And then they sign for it and they do whatever else. Now, I actually have no suspicion that they were diverting medication, but I look at that from a security perspective and I'm like, holy cow, that is not safe, right? It's the same two people, it's a huge stockpile of medications, and it happens the exact same way every month. All three of those are not good things. So if we have, here are two people who destroy things every month, but we're going to add a different person in every once in a while, or every month, we have a different set of eyes doing this and signing off, it makes it a much more secure process. What we have for you all from a toolkit perspective is a controlled substance administration documentation and waste competency that has the waste in it, that has those elements as we go along. We are getting close, friends. We are through the drug life cycle, and now we're going to the cross sections. You're almost there. The next part, hiring practices. So we talked to the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, I believe, to ask some questions about hiring practices because we knew that there were an awful lot of questions of what can I do and what can't I do, and what makes sense, and what do background checks look like, and what am I allowed to ask and what I'm not allowed to ask. So the first one is accurate medication management, including controlled substances and according to professional standards, is listed as an essential function of the job and job descriptions. So as you guys look at your job descriptions of people who are administering medications, put in there that they have to accurately administer controlled substances. It helps later on, but it also lets them know that you're serious about this. And so if I am someone who diverts and I start getting questions from the very beginning in my application process, if I start getting questions in my interviews, if I start getting questions about those things, I know that this facility takes this seriously. And if I have two job offers, one from someone who is asking those questions from the very beginning and talking about how seriously they take it, and someone who doesn't even mention it, I can tell you which job I'm going to pick if I'm the person who wants to divert medications on the job. And so strong clinical job descriptions set expectations for prospective and current employees and give the facility the ability to manage poor practice in medication. Because you may have someone who is not diverting, but is careless, and in the midst of the carelessness is helping create a culture where someone can't divert. The facility proactively sets expectations for professional behavior around medication management during the hiring process, e.g. the application, the interview, and the contingent offer. There is a sheet in there that gives you guys the information that the Office of Human Rights gave me. Because as long as you are consistent, you can ask these questions in an interview. If they give you information, you can ask follow-up questions that are not consistent. But you want to be asking, on the application you can ask, this is an essential function description of the job, do you believe you can do this successfully? In the interview, if you ask everyone, have you had a problem in the past with security of drugs or with administering controlled substances or pieces like that? As long as you're consistent, you can ask everyone that question. You just have to ask it consistently and in the same way. Employee job offers are contingent on successful reference checks from previous employers following all Minnesota law. Please follow all Minnesota law, but you can make your reference check. You can make your job offer contingent. We know there's a Minnesota system that you run people through. Some of you may have an additional system that you do. But we want to make sure if they have, we want to know their employment history, and we want to know ahead of time if there are red flags around medication management. Advanced recommendations. The facility creates a policy and is able to complete for-cause drug testing according to Minnesota standards where there is an incident that would warrant concern for resident safety. The Minnesota standards for this are insane. And I think I have a link to that on our website too. Not insane in that they can't be done, but you need to be very careful if you're completing for-cause drug testing. And then you need to have in your policy, what do we do with a positive sample? Or what do we do with an incidental finding? So it may be an oxycodone that is missing, but all of a sudden I have someone flagging positive for THC on their drug panel, and what in the world do I do if I know that my nurse is high on marijuana, even though they just cleared them for oxycodone? And so you have to have a policy and you have to be careful. And so this is one of those things where if you all are for-cause drug testing, there has to be an A sample and there has to be a B sample, and if the A sample tests positive, you have to test the B sample. And if someone, what are we doing if someone refuses drug testing? And you need to have all of those pieces in place. All of those are very clearly spelled out, but make sure you have a process and a policy that you follow. Advanced recommendations. So as I think we mentioned this, we may not have. Mike and I are from Colorado. And Colorado has had two of the worst diversion, awful things happen in our hospitals where people have infected gazillions of people with hepatitis in surgery centers and some other pieces like this. And so I know that we are in long-term care. But what those hospitals have put into place is actually third-party W-2 checking. And so many of them, as a part of their background process, they have people sign for it, but they have a third party go in and double-check W-2 forms so that if I got in trouble for drug diversion 2 jobs ago, but I just left it off my resume very conveniently, if I've received a W-2 from them, you guys can get a report of these are all the places that they've gotten a W-2 from, and you can go back and say, notice this one isn't on your job description, can you tell me what's going on? Or I call for references. I can call that, we make sure that people know what we are doing, and that they know we are doing a W-2 check and that it's a third party. But you can then make some phone calls and ask some questions. Again, I am not a human resources person. Ask some questions, but it's certainly a possibility to make sure that people are not hiding employment history. Our hiring practices, we have a controlled substance guidance document for hiring practices based on what the Minnesota Department of Human Rights told us. Feel free, if you guys have a system or something like that and you're doing mass changes, to call them and ask them for questions, or get on their website and start looking for some pieces. Education requirements. Our recommendation is that all employees participate in education regarding drug diversion, including the definition of diversion, how diversion harms residents. Making that clear connection is actually tremendously important for people. And to us, it's obvious and it makes sense. And yet when people understand from a resident-centered perspective, if we are here to take great care of people, this is something that you will have your eyes and ears open for while you are here. Facility-specific vulnerabilities. Where are some areas where we need to be really, really vigilant? Universal responsibility. Everyone has a responsibility. How to report suspected diversion. Who do I go to? What does this look like? And what will happen in the investigation process? Is someone going to throw me under the bus if I report? Is the worry. And then what to do if a person needs help with controlled substance addiction. I know that so-and-so has a problem. How do I even start doing that? And who do I talk to in our facility? Employee awareness decreases the opportunities for unnoticed or unobserved diversion. Clinicians who administer controlled substances should demonstrate competency in all aspects of the drug life cycle. We have that competency, we've talked about it. Clinicians who administer controlled substances should demonstrate competency in counting procedures and documentation. We've also talked about that. And then we have our all staff, our education content, everything from all staff all the way through to your hiring practices for orientation. Investigation recommendations. The facility should train leaders so that a trained investigator is available 24 hours per day. We do not know what this looks like from a resource perspective for you all, but at least an understanding of what are the first 4 things that I need to do. I need to make sure this is secure. I need to make these photocopies. I need to do these things until somebody else can come in. What are my first few steps that I need to do once I've found a problem? If there is a suspected diversion event or if there are controlled substances that are unaccounted for, an investigation should be launched immediately. This is education that everyone should have and you all should launch immediately. Delays in investigation, even a few hours, can allow an employee who is diverting to cover their tracks. So all of a sudden, something that you could swear was in that chart is no longer in that chart and I don't have a photocopy of it. So make sure that we're securing things, make sure that we're making photocopies, make sure that we're doing things as fast as we possibly can, because weirdly enough, things have a tendency to change sometimes when people know they're under investigation. And then facilities should complete a root cause analysis of all medication investigations, even if they were able to find the medication to resolve the discrepancy. The question is, can we move 2 or 3 steps upstream and ask questions to make sure that our process is as clear as it possibly should be, even if I was able to figure out what happened. And then we have our investigation guidance, our investigation template, and then the Minnesota Department of Health online root cause analysis toolkit, because we want you guys to be able to do that. The toolkit itself is, here are pictures of things in the toolkit, and we will get you guys, the last thing we'll do is get you guys our website information so you can write it down really big, you can go download stuff. The entire toolkit will be there for those of you guys who don't like paper around, and this 17 sheet of paper is going to end up somewhere in an office with an awful lot of other paper. It's all available online, the tools are available online, and everything is fully editable. Obviously, what we cannot say is if you guys put this 17-page document into place, no one will ever divert in your facility. We cannot promise that. What we can say, though, is that we want you guys really to assess and think through what makes sense. And so to start asking those questions, we want to make this as easy as we possibly can for you. And we're going to talk a little bit about toolkit feedback for you all. Oh, actually, I did put the website here. I wasn't sure if I did. It's Apiary Consulting, and I know that apiary is hard. So it's www.apiariconsulting.com. And then the MDH website is going to actually post a link to it on our website. So when you go to apiariconsulting.com, I believe it's under project links, and there is one of these cute little icons up there. I think it's the pill bottle. You click on that and it'll take you to all of the project links. It'll take you to the pathway. So you can use it as you need to. So I would like for all of you guys, we're going to take just a skosh of a break, but I want for every table at least 2 questions. So I want you guys to sit down and say, from the panel discussion, we have experts who are coming up. I have questions about all of this. First of all, I know I'm not going to put into place all 17 pages, so many of you guys have a hunch as to where you're going to get started. But I want you guys to think through, as we start, I'm going to take this back. What are some things that I can be doing, but also what are some questions I have or what some clarification or what in the world was the team thinking when they recommended this as we go forward. And I would love for you guys, we will be coming around, my 2 colleagues over there and I will be coming around to collect note cards. But if you guys can very intentionally ask some questions, we will have a panel discussion coming up. It is 11:11. We are going to start the panel discussion. We're going to give you 9 minutes. So at 11:20, our panel discussion will be here, and we'll go from there. But write down some questions, take a bathroom break, and we'll see you then. And grab them if people get them my way throughout all of this. I do have to tell you that we have a bit of a stack, so we'll get through what we can, and we're trying to combine if there are themes. We had 2 or 3 people ask the same questions, so we may answer it just once. But I want to introduce our panel. The first person to my left is Maria King. She is a registered nurse. She is a wife and mother of 3 and the grandmother of 6 going on 7 grandchildren, which is really fun. She works for the Minnesota Department of Health and has since 1993 and has held the role of a surveyor, of a trainer, of a supervisor, and then now the assistant program manager. And so she is our regulatory expert. If we have questions on how regulatory people in the Minnesota Department of Health see much of the drug diversion questions that we have or many of the drug diversion issues that we have, she is the person to ask those questions for. The second person on our panel is Joe. Joe Lindsay has worked with Thrifty White Pharmacy as a consultant pharmacist for 19 years. He's currently the Director of Consulting Services. In his role, Joe works with long-term care communities and pharmacies developing best practice medication management programs. He earned his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from North Dakota State University in 1994 and has specialized in geriatric medication management since the onset of his professional career. He is board certified in geriatric pharmacy, the past president of the American Society of Consultant Pharmacists in Minnesota, is a member of the Minnesota Association of Geriatrics Inspired Clinicians, and routinely provides medication-related education. And he sat on our panel, and he's awesome. Finally. The third person also sat on our panel, and she is awesome. This is Amanda Johnson, and she provided tremendous help for us because she spends a lot of her time doing investigations. She has worked in long-term care since 1989. She holds a bachelor's degree in human services, is a registered nurse and a licensed nursing home administrator. She works at Tealwood Senior Living, and her responsibilities include developing skilled nursing, housing assisted living, home care policy and procedures, health information technology, regulatory compliance, corporate compliance, collaborative performance improvement projects, multiple aspects of quality improvement, and company leadership. And what is amazing is that she took the time to be on the panel. She's served on several committees with care providers in Minnesota and is a frequent speaker on regulatory leadership, reimbursement, and other industry topics. And I don't know how to say Minnesota BELTSS, and I don't know how you guys say the acronym. She was recently appointed to them and formerly BENHA, is that how you guys said it? Okay, I know how to say it. We've worked with Oklahoma and we've talked to them a lot, but I don't know what the acronym is here. And then the last person on our panel is Amanda Vikstrom. She serves as the executive director of the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. And so she is here really to give us a victim's perspective or a resident-centered perspective on drug diversion. The mission is to mobilize communities to prevent and alleviate abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation of older and vulnerable adults. The Minnesota Elder Justice Center is a nonprofit organization that provides a helpline and free advocacy services for victims and concerned community members statewide, professional training and education, and policy and systems change advocacy. Amanda has over 20 years of experience working on behalf of victims of and sexual violence and elder abuse. Prior to her role with the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, she worked at the Anoka County Attorney's Office, where she managed the Minnesota Safe Elders Initiative and a major federal grant to coordinate multidisciplinary responses to in life. So we have a tremendous amount of knowledge sitting here at this table and a tremendous amount of experience. And what we're going to do is actually have them pass down a microphone, and each of them is going to talk for about a minute or a minute and a half, sort of about their perspectives walking into this conversation. And so we're going to just start here because you happen to be on my left, and talk a little bit, just briefly, about what your role is in all of this and how you see all of this.
Okay. So I'm Maria, and I'm representing the health department today, and I know that a lot of you make decisions and processes and implement those so that you can avoid getting what you refer to as a tag or a deficiency. And we partnered with this group. We had a member of our staff that participated in the planning of this and development of these guidelines and tools to make sure that things were done in accordance with how the regulations are. And it's our goal to work together to try and help people be prepared for these types of issues and to eliminate the risks that it puts you at and mainly to eliminate the risks that it puts your clientele at. So I guess hopefully that's enough for me to say right now. Turn it over to my colleague here.
Thank you. So, thanks for being here. And yes, I'm Joe Litzy. I'm a pharmacist. I've worked in long-term care for over 20 years. And I don't know if I had any experience or words of wisdom to give. It's been my experience that most of the time we see diversion when we're not following our own policies and procedures. I feel like over the years, for a lot of facilities, for most facilities that I deal with, we've put together, or they have pretty decent policies and procedures around accountability of controlled medications, but we find diversion when we're not following them to the T. So, you know, if that's one take-home message I could give, is just making sure that we're following our own policies.
Thanks, Joe. I'm not gonna stand up. That's not work. I would say this from a provider perspective. There were a few other providers that were part of the panel at different times. I think I was at most of the sessions, so that's how I got to sit here. I was gone the day they nominated me to do this. Anyway, what I would say about the toolkit is it's very comprehensive, and like most things, it looks like a little bit overwhelming in a lot of things. Your first instinct is going to be, as you read through this, and I'm even sure as it was presented, oh, we do that, oh, we do that, oh, we do that. And as Joe said, where we find the problem is where, oh, whoops, we weren't doing that. And I do participate in a lot of investigations. Unfortunately, far too many are potential and actual diversions. And the number one thing that has happened is somewhere the system failed. Whether they didn't do counts, I shouldn't say that. Not doing counts doesn't cause diversion. It makes it really, really difficult to find them. So none of these things as a whole are going to prevent diversion or attempted diversion. If someone wants to divert, they're going to go to the ends of the earth to make that happen. But what these processes and systems will do is make it a heck of a lot easier for you to detect it and to find them, and make it really, really difficult for them to do it. And that's what you need to do the most. You cannot necessarily change the individual based on these practices. But there's a lot of really good tools in here to help. And one other thing that I don't think is in a question, I'll just say it now. What also happens is, of course, when a system turns over, when a person turns over, a lot of systems fail or change quickly. I think having this toolkit as a backbone, I don't think any or very few of us have a policy and procedure that would be this detailed on how you manage narcotics. You probably have a pharmacy manual, you probably have a few guidances in your community, but you probably don't have all of this in one resource. And to take this toolkit and to individualize it to your community is going to provide your handoff, say you're gone, or you're going to move on, you're being promoted, or you're moving out of town, so someone else is going to be the director or be your quality assurance person. Here's now the best practice, and it's pretty easy to pick up and go, as opposed to a couple lines on a policy. We do count narcotics, nurses, double check, things like that. This really has great, great detail. And one other thing, if you go back, take this toolkit and actually look at your process, you might be surprised by how many holes there are. And I will tell you also through this process, I learned several things that I know we're going to take home with us and implement and make some changes.
Thank you. Good morning. My role here today is really to just remind us that it's not, as Andrea said, a victimless crime. And so when we talk about what happens when drugs are diverted, and part of our process to investigate and figure out what's wrong, that there's a victim at the center of it all, or a family at the center of it all, that also needs attention and empathy and support, and frankly repair with the trust that was probably lost between the provider and the victim. And so it's to really keep that victim at the center of the work that we're doing. So to think about the physical harm that was done to the victim by not having the medication, the lack of trust, that's just going to take a while to rebuild, and what can you as a provider, how do you put emphasis on that with the victim and the family to both admit or own what went wrong and be able to have that conversation. And I know that that's difficult to do for many reasons, but how do you have that dialogue with the victim and acknowledge what went wrong and how you're going to improve that and fix that, not just the system, but the relationship and the trust going forward. What are the services or supports that you can offer to that victim or family, or resources, our agency, other agencies, to help them move past? So that's sort of, I want that to kind of be present in, as we're talking about, you know, the regulation and the crime aspect, to think about how we also go about supporting that victim. And one other thing, I'm going to pass the mic back quickly, is to think about when we hear about these things, before kind of the process has started, before the investigation has started, the believing people is really important. And so many times victims will say something to a nurse or a provider that we dismiss because someone has a cognitive impairment, or we know on the chart that they got their meds. But to believe victims and explore the possibility that this could be an issue, that they are telling the truth, rather than having to have something build up over time before we realize that this has been an ongoing issue.
Thank you so much for the introductions. And we've collected all the cards and the questions across, and you each have a pile. Could we start with you, Mary, and you flip the top question and give us your answer, please?
Okay, so I actually surprisingly don't have as many, thought I might, so that's kind of nice for me today.
Sure.
Yeah, oh, fine. There's a question about which drugs are required to be double locked. And I can tell you that I understand why the question is being asked. There's a federal requirement at F761 that talks about storage of drugs and biologicals. And I think the piece that people miss will be clear here as I tell you what it says. So it says, the facility has to provide separately locked, permanently affixed compartments for the storage of controlled drugs listed in Schedule 2. And that's where people sometimes stop reading the requirement. However, it also says, and other drugs subject to abuse, except when the facility uses single unit packaging for drug distribution systems. So I know that one question that comes up is that occasionally we will find that there is Ativan.
Sure.
That is a very likely medication to be abused. And it is not necessarily, it's not in a single unit packaging, and so people are maybe using the same precautions that they might use with some of the other medications, and that you'll see deficiencies issued as a result of that. And I would guess that that's likely the context of this question. And I don't know if any of you have any comments that you want to make about that, or if that we're going to do that at the end, but that was my first question. So I think that, just a reminder that when you're looking at what the regulation itself says, you have to check for those words that indicate there's a little more to the story, and that "and" is in there. And I will just say to you that, frankly, for our teams as well, this was something that came up during our on-site survey with the federal surveyor, and we ourselves got some education in how we should be taking a look at that. So I think that that's that one.
Thank you.
Should I pass it along? Or
Yeah, we'll just
keep
keep going.
Good.
Joe, you have the dictation. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, no problem. There's a number of questions about liquid, liquid controlled substances, particularly like Roxanol, liquid morphine. There's many different strengths, but probably the most common one we see used is often in hospice, 20 milligrams per mil. And the fact that it's hard to accurately account for this liquid in this little morphine bottle. Everybody run into this problem before? Issue? So, compounding, and I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but compounding the problem is that on liquid medications, there can be up to 10% overfill in these bottles. So, when you think about that, it's very difficult to have a precise count when we're dealing with liquid medications. Can we use unit dose? We can try to use unit dose, sure, but then it's going to cost a lot more money, right? There are morphine that is supplied or the pharmacy can repackage like a 1 milliliter oral syringe, send it out that way, but certainly that's going to be more expensive. Another option might be sublingual, like Solucaps, Roxanol. But again, those all have to be made by the pharmacy, and it's quite a long process to actually do. I've not done it, but I know the pharmacists I work with do perform that. But again, that's also going to be more expensive. So it's again, you have to weigh the two things. Is it safety and accountability and cost? I mean, these are things that we have to think about, and I can't answer that question for each and every one of you, but it's something that should be addressed. I can also state too, another resource, and I should have probably said this earlier, is that, use your pharmacy as a resource. Probably most of you have a consultant pharmacist. Use your consultant pharmacist as a resource because they can help devise best practices for your individual community. And I know skilled facilities obviously have consultants. Assisted living, there's no requirement for it, but I do know we have gotten more involved in assisted living consulting just because of this, because the med management in our assisted livings is increasingly complex. And I found that we can help devise specific processes, policies, and procedures that fit your individual community. So think about that. So I think I answered a couple of questions on there. But yeah, as I said with the liquid, there's not a great answer. There's other avenues that we can use, but then they're going to be more expensive. And the other complicated thing, one more thing on like example morphine, is that there's several different manufacturers of that 20 milligrams per milliliter. And then there's shortages all the time. And so you might say, well, we like the morphine that's blue in color, because then you can see that better. Well, we run into shortages where you can't get that blue colored morphine. And then you have to supply it with the clear colored morphine, and then that further complicates it. So I know it's not a specifically great answer, but it's the best I have.
Thanks, Joe. This question is talking about us developing the recommendations. What would you see as the top 2 to 3 things to kind of get you started? I kind of alluded to that. I'm going to change it a little bit. And like one of my biggest takeaways were that I appreciated the research that was done was in the hiring practices. I think obviously, and that's going to segue probably into the next time around the questions that I have, but specifically adding narcotic counts and administrations as an essential function of the job, so that as you're doing disciplines and follow-up, you can link it to that, and the piece about being able to ask the questions if it's related to their job description was kind of I know as an organization we hadn't specifically linked it that way, and I think that creates a whole new empowerment from a leadership standpoint, and also by letting people know right up front that this is something you take seriously. And that's a really key thing, I think, is that we're demonstrating to our staff how serious we take this. I think another big step is when you look at this toolkit, don't look at it alone. I think include some other people. Again, it's very easy for us to assume all these things are happening, but your staff on the floor are the ones that are really going to have the answers. And taking that to the next step, weekends and evenings are the times that we're probably the most vulnerable, and we probably get the most lax because we don't have the extra people in the building. Unfortunately, that's when the bulk of our meds are delivered. So looking at that procurement and the security piece, those are areas that I think we take for granted. So I think those are big areas too. The other things all make great sense, and you have to look through your whole process, but those are sort of the ones that create some of the aha type things. Pharmacies that deliver and drop stuff on a desk, people that don't sign in, somebody that takes it for granted because the pharmacy always delivers right in the middle of the evening med pass, or something like that, where those types of things that really will be identified by talking to your staff. Do you want to say? You could say
No,
that.
just that another opportunity during that hiring process and interviewing is to have just conversations and questions around, and I'm sure many of you do this, but not just abuse, neglect, financial exploitation, but seeing older adults, residents as whole individuals, making sure that they can connect the care that they're giving to the individuals and understanding sort of the consequences of some of these issues that you're facing, drug diversion, others, how staff have an integral role in preventing them because they are the eyes and ears on the ground, and bringing them on board initially as someone that can help instead of assuming a position of, we're watching you, we think you might do this, but you are part of our team to prevent this from happening in the first place and empowering them to play that role.
Just go back to the meeting.
Please, we'll go back through that list.
So there's a couple questions that regarding specifically different medications. One about really what is most commonly prescribed or taken or diverted narcotic, is oxycodone that? And then another question about Neurontin, and maybe it's a good idea just to kind of talk a little bit about some of the individual medications. So, and plus there was new legislation that was approved, put into effect in July, and that had to do with narcotic analgesics. So not all controlled meds, but only narcotic analgesics. So what's a narcotic analgesic? It would be your oxycodone, hydrocodone, fentanyl, morphine, tramadol. Those the new legislation didn't involve like benzodiazepines. It didn't involve Neurontin. And I think it's so, I guess my point is I think it's important for us to all understand what the different controlled medications are and where they, what category they fit in. And, the opioid crisis is really focused on the opioid narcotic analgesic, which we commonly know as oxycodone, hydrocodone. Heroin is a narcotic analgesic, and I feel like that the whole conversation of illegal drug use and prescription abuse, misuse, it's all related, because there's a lot of the illegal medications such as heroin that are actually just simply opioid analgesics. So this is probably a much longer conversation, but I think it's important to review with your consultant pharmacist, maybe through some education, what are the different controlled medications, how are the rules, the new legislation, how does that affect them? And then so, as we think about drugs that are commonly diverted, then we can allocate our resources appropriately. And then the last question was about Neurontin or gabapentin. Currently in Minnesota, it's not a controlled substance. Federally, it's not a controlled substance. There's probably about 6, 7, 8, I'm not sure, states in which it is a controlled substance. And to what Maria talked about, what medications do we have to account for, block, et cetera, it's medications that we identify in our facility that could be or are being diverted. And so we are seeing more Neurontin or gabapentin being diverted. It's not a controlled substance, but if we worry about or if we have seen diversion around that medication, we should be putting processes in place to account for that medication. So anyway, that was a couple questions.
Okay, so I just want to add a caveat to a response that Joe gave a few minutes ago about liquid medications, and I'm not sure, I didn't read the questions myself, but just a reminder that when the requirements were modified in November of 2017, there's some really excellent guidance at 755 on liquid medications, so I just want to point your attention to that because I reread it while he was talking, and I think it's something that is really helpful just to be reminded of. I got a question about why, if a facility has correct processes in place, but diversion occurs, why is this a facility deficiency? And why can it reach harm or be an IJ? The person writing the question goes on to say that correct processes should be acknowledged and rewarded, not punitive for the facility with many long-term detrimental impacts. So here is my response for you, that when we review medications for being diverted, a lot of times it's as a result of a complaint that comes in, maybe by a family member, maybe by a resident themselves, and that complaint could come in because something was missing. They learned that their family member died or whatever, and then they learned that part of their meds were unaccounted for, or somebody had a lot of pain. And that's more likely where a resident will call in and say, I didn't get my pain medication, they told me that I already had it, I didn't get it, and then I suffered a lot of pain. So when you have people working for you, even if your policies are very good, things can still happen where things don't get done the way that they're supposed to be done. You are held accountable for the services that are provided in your facility and for the way that your residents' concerns, needs, issues are met. That might not seem fair, but that's kind of the nature of the business. That's on you, that's your responsibility. Okay, what we do is when we come to the facility and if we're looking at it and we find that somebody complained because they really had a lot of pain, they didn't get their medications, we determine that yes, in fact, that happened. Some part of your system failed. Even if you have the best policies in place, something happened if it really occurred that there was diversion and somebody didn't get their medication right. Okay, so we would make a decision about what it is that you were responsible for not doing. So was it that your policies didn't get implemented appropriately? Was it that there was not adequate supervision or whatnot? We would make a decision about what the scope and severity was based on the effect that it had on your residents. So a person had pain because they didn't get their narcotic for, maybe they had a hip fracture or something in their back and they had a lot of pain and they're supposed to be getting medication for that. Okay, so we might find out that when we're doing our investigation that some part of your system failed and that actually occurred and somebody didn't get their medication. So then we would say that there's a deficient practice, we'd identify what that deficient practice is, and then we'd make a decision as to what the scope and severity is. So the person suffered harm. Okay, so then we'd be looking at it could potentially be written at harm. Then we have to take a look at what did you do about it when you identified it. So now say that you called it into us, which I wonder if that might not be what the case is on this one here. Say that you called it into the health department and you said, we identified that we had a serious issue with diversion, right? So we come out, it gets triaged, we come out on site, we take a look at it, we determine, yeah, you're right, this happened, just the way that you just said, something happened where the system failed and somebody didn't get their medication. Okay, so what did you do about it? So the deficiency happened, Joe didn't get his pain relief because he missed his medications. Now we've done this. We've beefed up our systems, we've modified our practices in some way or our policies, we've maybe increased our supervision, maybe we've used this nice toolkit here to get some good ideas for what might help us in our facility. Okay, so you've actually corrected it. If Joe suffered harm, but you've already corrected it, you're probably still going to get a citation, but you're going to get what we call a past non-compliance citation, which I know is a bit newer, but we're finding that as we've implemented the federal complaints processes with our survey staff now, you all know that we're doing it just a little bit differently. It's still going to be identified, but in that way we're kind of giving you credit for having corrected it, okay? If Joe didn't suffer pain, but we know that there was this diversion and it was Joe's meds, and for whatever reason we find that we know that that occurred, but we can't really substantiate that Joe had any more pain than what he had before. And it's a complaint survey. We're going to say that we're substantiating that complaint, so we're still holding you accountable, but we won't be citing a deficiency. So we can substantiate it without a citation, because we're only doing, if you've already corrected it, we're only citing surveys that pass non-compliance with a deficiency if there was harm or higher. If there was no harm and you've already remedied it, it actually happened, we're going to substantiate that the deficiency occurred, but we're not going to give you a citation. Okay. That's probably really confusing to most of you, and I would be happy to respond to questions individually. It's been confusing for all of us as well, so I just want to be transparent with that. Nonetheless, you're held accountable for what happens in your facility. Same thing would be true if somebody had a fall and broke a hip, or if somebody had a diminished activities of daily living because they didn't get the care that they got. You'd still be held accountable. So you just have to think about it in those terms.
I have a couple questions, probably 3 questions that are about the health professional, is it service program? What is that? I'm looking at the employer. But I want to say a couple things before I talk about that, along with what Maria was saying, and there's also one in this question asked once the police are involved. So every even suspected diversion usually involves calling law enforcement right away. I can't think of a time that you wouldn't. Part of what is difficult at times is that we can do all the work we can. We're pretty darn sure we know who did it, and the police aren't going to do a darn thing about it. And that can be really frustrating because that person, nothing happens to them. If it's a unlicensed person, they don't come off a registry, and if they're licensed, there's nothing on their license. It's only what we said, and what we said, we can't tell everybody. So that's frustrating. We as an organization have made it our mission, where possible, to have any kind of vulnerable adult, and not just us, I know, but that's kind of a flaw with the system, period. So a lot of when we talk about hiring practices and background checks and things like that, there are gaps in the system where we can't find those people. Folks who have self-reported or been reported are in that, are through, and if you don't know, the Health Professional Service Program is a separate entity from the Board of Nursing itself, and it includes a few different licenses, and I don't know them all for sure. I think licensed administrators, nurses, and a few other professionals are in that, can be included in that program. And looking at that pre-hire and those questions is the perfect opportunity. And I think the people who are most successful are probably the ones who are open to admitting it and telling you they're in the program right away. You're going to find out eventually because they have to disclose it to the program. When someone's in the program, they need to disclose it to their employer, and there's typically some kind of reporting that you're required to do. I think from our perspective, we have not hired every person that's in the health professional program that's applied for us. We have had some. I think, again, you need to look at what the job is and where they're going to work, and just some reasonableness in what their access to medications would be, and what their history is. So there will be a lengthy piece of information in the Board of Nursing if they've had any kind of action against their license. And within the healthcare professional program, they'll tell you things. So not everyone is diverted that's in the program. They could be chemically dependent on, alcohol or other things. So everyone isn't a diverter, everyone hasn't committed a crime, they've had an issue, right? So those are all things to consider when you're reviewing their program. If it is somebody who has diverted, there are ways they do get back their license. They have some stipulations. Stipulations on a license are different sometimes than what their professional program requirements are. So they're just things you have to take into account, and I think be open with them and fair to them. If they've been convicted of a diversion as a crime, it's unlikely that they're going to get the license back for a very long time. I don't know if I think I answered all. There was 3 of those.
I'll just add a bit to the law enforcement piece. Yes, notifying law enforcement, even if sometimes you feel like you're calling on deaf ears, is critical. And that's an area that at the center we do a lot of training with law enforcement, and depending on the community, some law enforcement agencies are more adept and aware of issues related to abuse, diversion, neglect, financial exploitation of older vulnerable adults. But continuing to build that relationship with your local police departments, make sure that they investigate these as crimes. If you are hitting sort of that brick wall of, I mean, maybe they can't charge somebody in, or they can't file the charge with the county attorney's office in a specific case. You can talk to them about that specific case. If you're hitting more of a system-wide issue where they just are not responsive in general and don't want to investigate these, that's something that we'd be happy to try and work with you and help work with your law enforcement on around education of, you know, what the law says. I have worked with facilities before where I've literally sent statutes highlighted on a facility's behalf to a law enforcement agency so that they understood, you know, what the law is. You know, every street cop does not, well, we expect this, they just don't know every aspect of the law. And so being able to help provide that education, we're happy to help work with you and your local police department to do that. But I would encourage you to, these are crimes, and so push it and call law enforcement and report them. And don't see it as a failure if something, an individual case doesn't turn out the way that you think it should. Try.
So I'm gonna answer a couple of questions that were directed to us related to some data that was presented at the beginning. There was a question of where the 47 cases came from. And the 47 cases came from LTC. And there would be a larger data set if you pulled that directly, but we removed duplicates and we removed some that were just not pertinent to this review. There was multiple questions related to underreporting, and in the literature there's wide-ranging guesstimates of underreporting. I think there's general consensus that it's underreported, but the amount, there's really not great data. So we're going to go one more round through with questions, and then we'll close up.
Okay, great. All right, so I got a tough question here, and I'm going to play a politician card, which I don't like to do, but I feel like I have to. The question is, what is the safest method of destruction for the fentanyl narcotic patch? And so currently, we have been given direction by CMS, and we've said this at our provider calls, that it is the best practice is to take the fentanyl patch, fold that patch in half, where the sticky sides are together, and flush that down the sink of the toilet. And that is, of course, because of the very serious issues that have happened when those, the remaining medication in those patches gets in the wrong hands. However, I am aware that there are municipalities that will not allow you to sewer those patches or other types of narcotic medications. I am also aware of legislation in our state that is also referencing the same types of issues with being able to dispose of those products. So the reason why I'm going to respond to this as a politician is that I can't actually, with all honesty, be able to stand up here and say to you, this is how we're going to do it now, because I don't know that that's the case. But what I can do is give you a commitment that we will, that we are working on trying to come up with a good answer for all of you. And we will make sure that the provider organizations are a part of that. I know Doug Beards is in the room today, and he definitely has your best interests at heart, and he asks those hard questions all the time and consistently. He's very persistent, and I respect that. And so we're trying to come up with the best answer for you that we can. One thing that I can say to you is that in municipalities where you've checked with your water source people and you know that they will not let you sewer those products, that we have worked with individual providers as a result of that, and we know that there are a lot of products out there now on the market to address that issue, and we are, I hope, and if we're not, I hope that you'll tell me, but we are working with providers so that we can come to some kind of a reasonable solution and that won't cause you to get a division practice for that. So that's what I can say to you today, and then just give you the commitment that we're working on that.
Yeah, I can just piggyback on that too, is, you know, again, talk to your consultant about different ways of disposing and making sure that the way you do it is what they're recommending or what they're doing. You know, I have some thoughts on that, but for time purposes, I won't go into those right now. So, a couple questions that I had was, one was, how to transport drugs safely to a client's home. I'm assuming this is probably home care, nurses pick up, prescription, and drive home and deliver. So, I mean, I guess, I'm assuming that they pick up from the pharmacy, so the facility should have to be signing for that medication, or not, the person should have to be signing for that medication at the pharmacy, and when they drop it off at the patient's home, I would feel best practice would be for the person receiving the medications to sign that they received them. You know, it's just kind of a handoff and documentation of that handoff. You know, on a added note, you know, I think that's just best practice every time that we're, you know, when we do shift count, you know, it's that documentation piece. I mean, and really that's what we're talking about here is documentation piece. So we need to be documenting when we're handing off medications, when we're receiving, handing them off, whether it's shift count, receiving from the pharmacy, disposing of, properly documenting. I mean, when we do audits, we talk about following policies and procedures. One of the biggest lapses I see is just simply not signing the shift count log. You know, not consistently signing the shift count log. I see that over and over and over and over again. So, I mean, I think it's, again, the point is making sure that we're properly documenting. And then one more is about quantities. Some data regarding general number of post-surgical acute trauma-controlled narcotic doses suggest 8 doses at the most. I mean, I don't know if we can, there's not really a blanket statement that we can give of how long you're going to need a narcotic analgesic post-surgery. Again, the legislation says that for acute pain, you can dispense 7 days worth, up to 7 days. Now, there's a caveat that says that if it's the professional opinion of the provider that longer than 7 days is needed, they're not limited to that 7 days. And pharmacy also should make an effort to determine why a controlled medication or narcotic analgesic is prescribed. And, you know, it's not saying that they cannot dispense more than 7 days worth, but we're supposed to be using our clinical judgment and assessing that patient and using patient-centered care when we're dispensing, when we're prescribing, when we're administering these medications. So it's just really good, following good patient-centered care. So we're not limited to 7 days, but it's a general guideline. Best I can say.
This question was about documentation and nurses feeling like if there's holes in, you know, EMARs and MARs, that's a discrepancy and they want to report it all as med errors. I think, and how do you change that perception? I think going through this whole process and reviewing that we're dealing with a just culture and we want everyone to be open and honest and reviewing from step 1 of medication administration all the way through to these competencies that you see on narcotic administration is a great way to just remind people. All of us went to school to be nurses, but a lot of us forget what we learned sometimes. So I think just reminding them, working with them through this whole process, and you know, it's okay to say, hey, I see you forgot to, if the shift change, you know, that's something you do. It's where are my holes, who left the holes, let's get those accounted for now, validate that the med was given. Most of us have a unit dose dispensing system where it's pretty easy to tell if a med was given or not. And those are all things in your toolkit to help you. And then one more thing I wanted to say that wasn't a question, because Joe talked about home care. These tools and this toolkit definitely applies to assisted living and other settings. So don't think it's just for SNFs. All of these things, to some moderate variation, would also work in assisted living. Obviously, who's giving the medications is significantly different, but the practices in general are still very good.
So we're gonna wrap this up a bit, kind of right around on time actually, but first of all, thank you so much to our panel, and we appreciate the time. forward, we have told you all, we know that as you go back to your facilities, you have a lot of competing priorities. And so I hope that this gives you sort of some first steps to take. When I go back, here are the things that I can do to apply what I've learned. I see many of you all filling out your evaluations. We would love good feedback as we go forward. This project has a little bit more time on it. And so if you are interested in this, or you feel as if your facility would absolutely benefit from implementing many of these practices, we are looking for a few facilities to work with and to follow as they implement practices to help understand how this toolkit is working, to get feedback on the toolkit. You'll notice at the bottom of it, it says version 1.0. We are pretty darn sure that this is going to change as you all put things into place. And we hear some things are working really, really well, and some things need additional clarification, or this would be great if only you had this tool, or we would love this if this came in the form of PowerPoint instead of bullet points. Whatever it is, first of all, feedback would be unbelievably welcome, because we've involved a lot of stakeholders, and yet as anything goes out into the world, even today we found about 2 typos on our slides that we did not know were there, and we have been through these slides with a fine-tooth comb. And so we would love feedback as we move forward. If you are part of a home that says, gosh, I would love to have some additional help and some additional sort of discussion as we move forward over the next 6 to 8 months, we would love to have a rural home and an urban home and some different big and little and some homes to sort of see how does this look in the real world as we put it into place to actually say, is this useful and is this helpful, or what additional pieces would be useful and would be helpful. So if you are interested in that, you can come and talk to either Mike or me, or actually Rachel, can you wave? Rachel is the first person you saw today, and she would also be a great person to ask. We'll write down your name and we'll go from there. The next piece is I had you guys write down, and I kept up there the apiary consulting at www.apiaryconsulting.com. There will also be a link from the Minnesota Department of Health that will send you to our website for those tools. They are going to be up from now until they change. But feel free to go into there to pull things down, to use them liberally, and to do with them what you will. And then the last piece that I wanted to say is thank you guys. I know that it was not without thought that you guys set aside half of a day to come and learn about drug diversion. And I am so grateful for your interest. I am so grateful for your willingness to learn, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do to take care of residents across Minnesota. The work you do is tremendously important, and we are so grateful for each one of you as we work and take great care of people. So thank you for your time. Fill out your evaluations, and we will let you go just a scratch early to go grab lunch.